If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 1, Useless. Failure. A joke. Hello y'all. First of all, the Cassian you will be seeing in the first 2 chapters is not the main character of this FIC. Get past the 3rd chapter before judging. Thank you. Secondly, I was sitting on this one for a while now, and I think it is finally time to share. This is my latest and honestly, I think best FIC so far. I don't want to overhype it, but I really enjoyed writing this one. Cassian turned out to be such a fun, chaotic character to work with, and I hope you will all enjoy him just as much as I have. Without further ado, let's get to it. Cassian sat at the grand dining table of the Rosier family, surrounded by relatives who barely tolerated his presence. The long, polished table gleamed under the enchanted chandelier, set with fine silver and delicate crystal, but he could feel their disdain on his skin. They all knew what he was, an embarrassment, a near-Squib with nothing to offer except a surname. And yet, his father insisted on keeping him at the table, forcing everyone to acknowledge his existence. A house elf scurried up, hands trembling as it placed a plate of pastries in front of him. Cassian didn't bother looking as his boot connected with the elf's ribs. The sharp crack of impact made the creature yelp and skid across the marble floor like spilled wine. "What the hell is this?" he sneered, flicking a piece of pastry off the plate with disgust. "Did I ask for a pile of pastries or a serving of smeared turd?" The elf, Towel, whimpered, scrambling to its feet, but before it could stammer an apology, Cassian's uncle, Armand Rosier, let out a mocking laugh. "Such refined taste for someone who can't cast a proper lumos," Armand drawled, reaching for his wine. "You should be grateful the elves even bother serving you." A few chuckles rippled down the table. Cassian's grip tightened on his fork, but he forced a smirk. "Right, because you lot are such culinary experts," he shot back, leaning back in his chair. "Half of you wouldn't know the difference between wine and vinegar if the bottle didn't have a fancy label." His aunt, Viola, wrinkled her nose. "At least we know the difference between a proper wizard and a..." She waved her hand vaguely in his direction. "Well, whatever it is you are supposed to be." Cassian's father, Regulus Rosier, cleared his throat sharply. "Enough." His tone wasn't sharp or loud, but it was enough to quiet them. "Cassian is still my son and still a Rosier. He will have his place." Viola gave a delicate sniff and returned to her meal. The rest followed suit, though the occasional smirk and sidelong glance made it clear they weren't done enjoying the moment. Cassian stabbed at his food with unnecessary force, appetite ruined. He knew exactly why his father insisted on dragging him to these gatherings. It wasn't out of affection, it was because Regulus couldn't stomach the idea of his son being a complete failure. No matter how much Cassian botched every lesson, every spell, every single thing he tried, his father refused to give up on the ridiculous notion that he could still be useful. And if there was one thing Cassian despised more than his family's mockery, it was pity. The conversation drifted to more pressing matters, the ministry, bloodline politics, recent dealings with the other sacred 28 families. Cassian ignored most of it, sipping his wine and watching the way his relatives spoke. His cousin, Damien, was discussing something with his father, Alistair, something about a new law being pushed through the Wisengamot. "Mulciber is backing it, but he is an idiot if he thinks it won't come back to bite him," Damien said, swirling his glass. "He is pushing too hard. The Bones girl is making a fuss, and for once, the half-bloods are paying attention." "Let them whine," Viola murmured. "It won't change anything." "It does if they start looking into old records," Damien countered. "We've been careful, but not careful enough. If they dig, they will find things." Cassian arched a brow. "And what, exactly, are they looking for?" Damien shot him a look, half amused, half dismissive. "Nothing you need to worry about." "Right, of course," Cassian muttered, tipping his chair back slightly. Cursing under his breath. "Glad you understand," Armand said, smirking over his wine glass. Cassian clenched his jaw but forced out a laugh. This was how it always went. Every meal, every gathering, every moment spent in this house was just another opportunity for them to remind him of what he wasn't. He finished his wine and stood, pushing his chair back with an obnoxious scrape against the floor. "As riveting as this has been, I have far more important things to do than listen to you all prattle on about your latest political schemes." "Yes, running off to, what is it you do all day?" Viola mused. "Certainly not practicing magic." Cassian's grin was all teeth, cold and wolfish. Wouldn't you like to know? He didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and strode out of the dining room, ignoring the murmurs and the chuckles behind him. The halls of the Rosier estate were as cold as the people in it. Ornate, grand, dripping with wealth, but utterly lifeless. Cassian hated it. He made his way to the small study, his father's, technically, but Regulus rarely used it. He was always in the main study. The fireplace crackled dimly, casting long shadows against the bookshelves. Cassian poured himself another glass of wine from the decanter on the desk and dropped into the leather chair, stretching his legs out. He barely rested for 10 minutes, before a low pop signaled the arrival of a house elf after. "Master Cassian, your father wishes to speak with you." "Of course he does." Cassian exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders before standing. "Fine." He followed the elf back down the hall to Regulus's private office. The door was already open. His father sat behind a heavy wooden desk, fingers steepled, eyes sharp. "Sit." Cassian did, not bothering to hide his boredom. "What is it now?" "Another lecture on how I am failing the family name." Regulus ignored the jab. "You need a place in this family. I am tired of watching you waste time. You can't duel. You have no talent for business. Politics." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Well, you would be eaten alive." Cassian raised his glass in mock agreement. "Excellent summary. So what is the point of this conversation?" His father leaned forward, fingers still steepled. "I will give you one last chance, Cassian." Cassian sighed, swirling the wine in his glass. "Lucky me." Regulus ignored him. "In a week, during the summer festival, our family is hosting a public lecture for mudbloods and worse. Your cousin Damien was supposed to handle it, but I need you to get something right for once." He exhaled sharply. "I don't expect much anymore, but do it for your brother. He has the best chance at inheriting the patriarch's seat. Don't embarrass us." Cassian smirked. "Ah yes, the sacred Rosier reputation. Merlin forbid I stain it any worse than your side ventures already have." Regulus's jaw tightened. "You think this is a joke?" "I think it is a pathetic waste of time," Cassian said, setting his glass down with a dull clink. "So you expect me to stand there, wagging my wand and spoon-feeding spells to filthy mudbloods? Is this a lecture or a circus act for your amusement? But fine. I will stand up there and say whatever you want, if it means you will stop whining about me ruining the family name." "You already have," Regulus said coolly. "This is about whether you will sink further or at least try to claw your way up." Cassian slumped in the chair. "Oh, now that is a heartwarming sentiment. So, what do I actually have to do? Recite some nonsense about blood purity? Throw in a few threats? Maybe hex a mudblood for dramatic effect?" "You will conduct yourself properly," Regulus snapped. "You are a disgrace, but you are still a Rosier. Try not to drag our name further into the muck. And you can't hex anyone even if you wanted to." He took breath to calm himself. "This time, you will be teaching." Cassian arched a brow, swirling his wine lazily, ignoring the insult. "Oh? And what exactly am I supposed to teach?" Regulus exhaled through his nose, clearly unamused. "Advanced magic. Defensive spells. Things that reinforce our position." He cut himself off, studying Cassian for a long moment before sighing. "But seeing as you can't manage even the basics, we will settle for something simpler. Lumos will do. As long as you don't make a mess of that, at least." Cassian set his glass down, shooting up to his feet. "You are joking." His father's expression didn't shift. "Do I look like I am joking?" Regulus leaned back, voice cold. "This is your last chance, Cassian. Do this, or you are out. I won't have a failure staining this family's name any longer. If you embarrass us, you will be disowned." Cassian scoffed, but the weight of it settled deep in his chest. Regulus wasn't bluffing. Not this time. Scoffing to show his displeasure, Cassian left the office and returned to his room, irritation thrumming under his skin. "Towel! Get the hell in here!" he barked, barely inside before the house elf appeared with a crack, bowing so low its long ears nearly swept the floor. "Yes, Master Cassian," it squeaked. "Wine," he snapped, slumping into the armchair near the fireplace. "And don't take all day about it." The elf vanished, reappearing a second later with a fresh glass. Cassian snatched it without so much as a glance, downing half of it in one go. Lumos. That was what his father expected of him. Lumos. His fingers tightened around the glass. He could barely manage a bloody spark. Regulus knew that, and yet here he was, being paraded around like some trained krupp expected to jump on command. He sank deeper into the cushions, watching the fire crackle. The Rosiers weren't known for their patience, and his father had finally run out of it. This was the last chance before they cut him off entirely. No inheritance, no name, nothing. Not that his name had done him any good. The only thing worse than being looked down on was knowing they weren't wrong. The thought soured his drink, and he shoved the glass onto the side table, almost spilling it. A knock rattled the door. What? It swung open, and Damien stepped inside, looking as smug as ever. So, I hear you've been given a grand opportunity, he drawled, shutting the door behind him. Cassian didn't bother to sit up. Must be a slow night if you've come all the way here just to gloat. Damien's grin sharpened, eyes glittering, he leaned against the door frame. I don't need to gloat, Cassian. You do all the work for me. A lecture? On magic? You. He laughed, shaking his head. I am almost impressed. Almost. Cassian rolled his eyes. It is called delegating, cousin. I will stand up there, say a few words, and then make one of the elves do the demonstration. No one actually expects me to teach anything. Damien's grin stretched wide, all teeth and amusement. Oh, Cassie! If it were that easy, do you think Uncle would have sent you? He stepped further into the room, lazily dragging a finger along the edge of the desk, eyes flicking over the clutter as if Cassian's very existence was some kind of personal joke. Dear Uncle wants Lucian to take over the family, and to do that, he needs some backing. But, how fate is cruel. His youngest son is a squib. He fought grandfather over this, you know? Took away my public appearance just to shove you onto the stage. Cassian tried to brush it off, but his jaw clenched hard. Touching. Really? Must have been a hard blow to your ego. Damien chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, I am magnanimous, cousin. If you screw this up, when I take over the family, I might spare you a room. Maybe even feed you 3 times a day, if I am feeling generous. What do you say? Because let's be honest, I doubt Lucian would even offer that much. Cassian reached for his glass and took a sip. Sour as it was, he would rather drown in it than listen to Damien sober. You've really thought this through. Should I be flattered or concerned? Damien laughed, slow and cold, the kind that came from someone who knew they were winning. He pushed off the desk and crossed the room in a few lazy strides, plucking up a book from the shelf. I don't need to think it through, Cassian. It is obvious. You are a failure. Uncle is desperate, and this is his last gamble. And you? He turned the book over in his hands, flipping through the pages carelessly before tossing it onto the chair opposite Cassian. Well, you will mess it up. That is what you do. Cassian's knuckles whitened on his glass before he forced his lips into a lazy curve. Your faith in me is truly heartwarming. Damien watched him with that same irritating amusement. Oh, it is not lack of faith. It is just a pattern. You've spent your whole life failing. Why should this be any different? Cassian exhaled through his nose, setting his glass down. Are you done, or did you come here just to hear yourself talk? Damien's smirk didn't waver. Just making sure you know what is at stake. Uncle might be keeping you around for now, but if you embarrass him at the lecture, you will be out for good. No inheritance, no name, nothing. You will be a nobody. Cassian let out a derisive huff. Oh, the horror. Whatever will I do without my adoring family? Damien shrugged. That is the thing, isn't it? You've got nothing else. No skill, no allies, not even a shred of magic worth a damn. The moment they cut you loose, you are done. He turned and strolled toward the door. Enjoy your wine, cousin. It might be the last good thing you will ever have. And do remember, my offer stands. If you manage to botch this harder than even I expect, and drag poor Lucian down with you, I will give you a cupboard to sleep in and toss you scraps from the table. Out of pity, of course. Think it over. With that, he left, shutting the door behind him. Cassian sat there, fingers drumming against the armrest. Useless. A failure. A joke. I am starting to early publish this on Patreon, chapters will start dropping daily, and I will build up to 30 advanced chapters as usual. I will be posting it free on Webnovel and other platforms, so it can go public like the others. None of my FICs are hidden behind paywalls, only the drafts. Please give feedback. I mean it, anything and everything. Does the pacing feel good? Are the magic mechanics fun? Are you as entertained by Cassian as I was while writing? Tell me what works, what doesn't, what you want more of. This is your chance to shape it while it is still warm out of the oven. Thanks again for sticking around and supporting me. You make it possible for me to take big swings like this and actually share them. Appreciated. Chapter 2, List. Useless. A failure. A joke. They'd been calling him that for years. Since childhood, since his first failed spell, since it became painfully obvious he wasn't like the rest of them. The only thing he'd ever been good at was running his mouth, and even that wasn't enough to keep him in their good graces. He reached for his wine, only to find the glass empty. Lumos. That was what his father expected of him. A simple bloody light spell, something even first years could manage in their sleep. His teeth ground so hard, it made his jaw ache. He could do this. He had to. Or he was out. And no matter how much he hated them, no matter how much he sneered at the whole twisted, self-important mess that was his family, he wasn't ready to be nothing. The next few days were spent locked in his room, staring at his wand like it was some kind of puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Come on, you useless twig, he muttered under his breath, flicking it sharply. Lumos. A pathetic flicker of light sparked at the tip, then fizzled out almost immediately. Cassian gritted his teeth. Again. Lumos. Nothing. He sighed through his nose and began stalking the room like a caged animal. This was ridiculous. He wasn't an actual squib. He had magic. He just wasn't good at it. That wasn't the same thing. Another flick. Another failure. The next flick sent the wand clattering against the wall. Arg. Cassian raked a hand through his hair and paced harder. Fine. If magic wouldn't work, he would do what he did best. Bullshitting. The day of the lecture arrived faster than he would have liked. Cassian stood in front of the gathered crowd. Mudbloods, half-bloods, a few lower-ranked purebloods looking to climb their way up. His father sat in the front row, watching with sharp, expectant eyes. Damien lounged beside him, smirking. Cassian paced the back room, sweat prickling at the back of his neck. His collar strangled him, his robes weighed a ton, and his gut churned like a cauldron ready to boil over. He was fucked. Absolutely, royally, irreversibly fucked. The festival hall buzzed on the other side of the door, the walls vibrated with voices, shifting chairs, clinking glasses. His father was out there. Uncles and aunts, too. Probably grinning like an easel waiting to watch a rat drown. Any minute now, they would call his name, and he would have to step onto that stage and pretend he had even a fraction of the skill expected of him. He gripped his wand so tightly his knuckles went white. Lumos, he muttered. Not even a flicker. His jaw clenched. He shook out his wrist, tried again. Lumos. A flicker of light sparked at the tip before sputtering out. Cassian let out a sharp breath, resisting the urge to fling the useless twig across the room again. This was a joke. A bad one. Regulus had thrown him into this knowing damn well he couldn't pull it off. This wasn't a second chance, it was a test, a last-ditch effort to prove whether he had even the slightest worth. And if he failed, that was it. No more dinners at the family table, no more inheritance, no more anything. He would be cut off completely, left to rot in some dingy back alley with nothing but his name, and even that would mean fuck all once they disowned him. Cassian smacked his thigh, hissing under his breath, hoping the pain would jolt his drowning mind clear. Should I just run? I got some gold. Could live in the Muggle world or something. The thought was stupid. He would be dead in a month, probably less. He knew jack shit about Muggles, besides what little they taught at Hogwarts to mock them, and he was about as capable of surviving on his own as a flobberworm in a drought. But staying here meant walking onto that stage, holding up his wand, and proving, again, just how much of a failure he was. I would sooner hex myself into oblivion than grovel with those filthy Muggles. His fingers curled around the useless bit of wood in his hand. Lumos, he muttered. Nothing. His eyes pulsed, hot and tight in their sockets, his breath coming short and shallow. He'd never actually panicked about magic before. He'd been angry, humiliated, pissed off at the universe for making him a Rosier with all the magical talent of a sack of potatoes, but he'd never felt like this. Like something inside him was clawing at his ribs, trying to get out. A sudden, splitting pain tore through his skull. His vision blurred, the world tilting, collapsing inward. Then, silence. For a moment, there was nothing. No stress, no fear, no sneering relatives waiting for him to humiliate himself. Just a hollow void, stretching endlessly. Then, a jolt, felt being yanked forward by invisible hands. Cassian's eyes flew open as if someone had doused him in ice water, but the wary focus behind them was unmistakably different. The first thing he noticed was the floor. Black marble, polished to a high shine, reflecting the dim glow of candlelight. The second thing was his own hands. Pale. Thin. Unfamiliar. What the fuck? Cassian, or whoever the hell he was now, stared at them, flexing his fingers, feeling the odd disconnect between thought and movement. He reached up, running a hand through his hair, finding it longer than he was used to. His heart pounded against his ribs, confusion surging like a tidal wave. Then the memories hit. A flood of thoughts, images, emotions that weren't his, except they were. A grand dining hall. Mocking laughter. A father's cold disappointment. A wand that barely sparked. Like pieces of a puzzle he had no interest in solving, memories filled his vision. Cassian Rosier. That was his name. His life. His problem now. The realization slammed into him like a brick wall. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was, where? Back on Earth? A teacher? A normal fucking person? He was alive, living his completely unremarkable life, and now? Magic. He was in a fucking magical world. A sharp knock rattled the door. Master Cassian. A voice called. It is time. His stomach twisted. Time for what? He scrambled through the borrowed memories, trying to piece together what the hell was happening. A lecture. Magic. Lumos. Oh, fuck. He didn't know how to do magic. He just learned magic was real. Panic clawed up his throat. The old Cassian was barely capable, but at least he knew how to try. He didn't even have that. He had no clue how wands worked, no idea if he was supposed to feel something or channel something or... The knock came again, more panicked, urgent this time. Cassian, no, he had to stop thinking like that, he was Cassian now, whether he liked it or not. He took a shaky breath and forced his legs to move. One step, then another, until he reached the door. His hand hovered over the handle. Breathe. Just fake it. You are good at that. He opened the door. A house elf stood there, hunched and wringing its hands, shivering like it expected a kick at any moment. It didn't even dare to meet his eyes. Ah! Cassian yelped, taking a quick step back. The poor creature flinched so hard it nearly toppled over. Cassian blinked, his mind scrambling. Right. House elves. He recognized this thing now, memories that weren't his still slotting into place. But that wasn't what rattled him. It was the sheer familiarity of the term. House elf. He knew that from... Oh, for fuck's sake. The Harry Potter discussion. His mates back home had gone on about it now and then, something about books, films, a world full of magic. But he'd never read the damn things. Never seen the films either. Just nodded along, maybe made a joke or two about broomsticks up the arse. And now he was in it. He swallowed the rising panic and crouched slightly, eyeing the elf. Sorry about that, Cassian blurted, his words awkward. The apology felt strange in his mouth, like wearing someone else's skin. Didn't mean to startle you. You all right? The creature gasped like he just split reality in half. Wide, bulging eyes locked onto his face, pure disbelief written across every wrinkle. Cassian frowned. What? The elf opened its mouth, closed it, then gave a shaky bow. Master Cassian. Master Cassian is. It shook its head violently. Master Cassian must come now. Master Regulus is waiting. Right. That. He took a slow breath and straightened up. No time to deal with whatever the hell that reaction was. He had bigger problems. Like stepping onto a stage and pretending he had a single clue about magic. The walk through the hall felt longer than it should have. His mind kept drifting, like he could somehow think his way out of this mess. He needed a plan. A way to fake it. But his thoughts were a mess, fragments of his own and Cassian's memories colliding. He froze mid-step. Wait. Lumos. That was a phone command in his old life, wasn't it? Something about turning on the flashlight. And Lumos sounded a hell of a lot like lumen, which meant light. That was it. A light spell. He sighed, adjusting his robes. All right. He could work with that. He might not know magic, but he knew light. He could bullshit his way through a lecture about it. The magical world was stuck in the bloody dark ages anyway, half these people probably didn't even know what electricity was. He could rant about wavelengths, refraction, candle power, whatever. As long as he looked confident, they would eat it up. The corridor stretched ahead, leading to the stage. His father's voice echoed faintly beyond the door, probably introducing him. He picked up the pace, ignoring the way his palms felt a little too clammy. Then something shifted. Not in the room. Not around him. Inside. It wasn't a voice. No dramatic whisper in his ear, no deep, ancient presence. Just a feeling, like something in his head had opened. A book. No, not a book. A scroll, endless, unfurling in his mind. A list. Ballot box with checkmark Lumos, first year spell, insufficient mastery. Ballot box with checkmark Nox, first year spell, insufficient mastery. Ballot box with checkmark Alohomora, first year spell, insufficient mastery. Ballot box with checkmark Wingardium Leviosa, first year spell, insufficient mastery. Ballot box with checkmark Flipendo, first year spell, insufficient mastery. What the hell does first year spell mean? Cassian frowned, scanning his borrowed memories. A vague recollection surfaced, something about learning them in his first year at that oversized medieval castle they called a school. Hogwarts. Right. He sighed sharply, eyeing the strange floating list in his head. Lumos, first year spell, insufficient mastery. A whole menu, just hanging there in his mind like some ridiculous game interface. His mouth twitched. Well, that is bloody weird. He focused on Lumos. As soon as he did, more details unspooled in his head, like flipping through a book. Various descriptions unfurled in his mind, as if he were leafing through a guide, reading neatly organized explanations of the spell. Lumos, first year spell. A basic light-producing charm. Primarily used to illuminate dark areas. Commonly taught in the first year at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Incantation, Lumos. Required wand movement, a small upward flick. Then, another layer, like hearing a professor drone on about it. Lumos is the most elementary of illumination charms. A simple spell, requiring minimal magical effort. Proper pronunciation and wand movement are key. Any competent wizard should be able to perform it with ease. Cassian nearly laughed. Any competent wizard. Yeah, well, that ruled him out, didn't it? Chapter 3, Lumos. More descriptions filled his mind as he stepped onto the stage, hundreds of eyes settling on him. Cassian's instincts kicked in. He straightened, letting a grin stretch across his face, scanning the crowd like he wasn't standing on the edge of disaster. He'd taught before, granted, that had been in a past life, and his students hadn't expected him to perform actual magic, but the principle was the same. Confidence was half the game. Good evening, he said smoothly, projecting his voice across the hall. I am sure you are all eager to learn something useful tonight. Luckily for you, I am in a generous mood. Some in the crowd perked up at that. Others shifted uncomfortably, likely expecting another Rosier lecture about blood superiority. Cassian let the tension stretch for a second before continuing. He glanced at the floating text still lingering in his mind. Clear mental image and intent ease spellcasting. Right. That made sense. Same principle as muscle memory, visualize, focus, execute. Cassian turned slightly, holding up his wand between fingers like it was the most natural thing in the world. Let's start with something simple. Lumos, the basic illumination charm. Everyone here has heard of it, I assume. The audience chuckled, a few outright laughing. Someone muttered, he can't be serious. Lumos? At a lecture? They expected theory on high-level dueling, dark magic countermeasures, maybe some ancient Rosier spell work, something that justified sitting through a speech from the family's embarrassment. But Cassian just stood there, completely unfazed, twirling his wand lazily in the air like he hadn't just insulted their intelligence. "This is a joke, right?" someone near the back whispered. Cassian let the laughter settle before speaking again, perfectly at ease. "I get it. What is the point of talking about Lumos? It is the first spell every magical child learns. You could teach a donkey to do it with enough treats." He tilted his head. "But here is the thing, most of you don't actually know what you are casting. You memorize the words, wave your wand, and assume it works because that is just how magic is." His wand flicked up, pointed loosely at the ceiling. Lumos. Nothing happened. Cassian took it in stride, not so much as blinking. He hummed, glancing at his wand as if appraising a faulty product. "Well, that is embarrassing." He snapped his gaze back to the crowd, then, with a slight tilt of his head, he asked, "Or did I fail because I didn't intend to cast magic?" His wand spun lazily. "Tell me, if you accidentally said Lumos mid-conversation, would your wand light up?" Murmurs rippled through the audience. A few exchanged glances, unsure whether he was making a point or just covering his own failure. Cassian let them stew for a moment, then leaned against the podium. "Magic isn't just words and wand waving. Otherwise, we would be seeing accidents every time someone swore in Latin." He tapped his temple with the tip of his wand. "It is about intent. Thought. Understanding." He scanned the room. The richer purebloods looked bored, unimpressed. The half-bloods and lower-rank attendees, though, were listening. Good. He could work with that. "Now, humor me for a second," he went on, pushing off the podium and pacing a few steps. "What is light?" Brows furrowed as whispers spread. Cassian exhaled, shaking his head. "You see? That is the problem. You cast a spell to create light, but you don't even know what light is." He pointed at a random wizard in the crowd, some older man with thinning hair and an expensive robe. "You, sir. What is light?" The man blinked. "It is brightness." "Wow," Cassian deadpanned. "Truly, you've cracked the mysteries of the universe." That earned a few chuckles, and he pushed forward before anyone could interrupt. "Light is waves. Particles. Pure energy ripping through space so fast it could lap the Earth 7 times before you even blink. It bends, it refracts, it changes depending on what it hits. And you think a 2-syllable word and a wand flick makes that happen? Magic follows rules. Just because we don't always understand them doesn't mean they don't exist. And if you do understand them..." He whipped the wand skyward. Lumos. A small, steady glow sparked at the tip. Cassian resisted the urge to heave a sigh of relief. Clear mental image and intent ease spell casting. Right. That. He was going to have to remember that. He lifted the wand higher, letting the light wash over his face. "Now, some of you might think, well, that is just magic doing its thing, who cares? But here is the fun part, spells change depending on the caster. And not just in strength. The more you know about something, the more it shapes what you are doing." He let the light flicker out and turned back to the audience. "Ever noticed how different wizards cast the same spell slightly differently? Maybe someone's Lumos is brighter, someone else's is dimmer. Some glow golden, some bluish. Why? Because magic isn't just memorization, it is interpretation." He leaned forward, lowering his voice so that the audience had to strain to hear. "Lean forward. What happens when someone truly understands light? When they grasp not just the incantation, but the nature of it." He raised his wand again, this time focusing, not on just light but on everything he'd ever known about it. The speed, the wavelengths, the way it bent through glass, the way it could be blinding or soft, warm or harsh. The mental image sharpened in his head. Lumos. The light flared up, brighter than before, not just a simple glow but a near-blinding white radiance. A few in the front row squinted, shielding their eyes. Cassian tilted his wrist, and the light softened, shifting from sharp white to a golden hue, warm and soft. The floating text in his mind shifted, Lumos, slightly improved. Interesting. He let the glow linger a moment longer before flicking his wand, letting it die out. See? Same spell, different results. He paced the stage, pulling more from the old Cassian's memories. These changes? They are called spell variations. Lumos Solemn, Lumos Duo, Lumos Maxima. Different names, but the core spell is the same. Lumos. Light. He pointed at the back wall. The suffix just sets intent. Gives it structure. But the real magic? That is all in how you imagine it. He flicked his wand. Lumos Solemn. A bright, golden glow burst from the tip, spreading in a warm, sun-like radiance. The audience squinted, some shielding their eyes. Cassian let it hold for a few seconds before cutting it off. Whispers spread across the rows. That wasn't just a stronger Lumos, it felt different. More intense. Now, he said, rolling his shoulders, watch this. He raised his wand again, this time with nothing but the single word. Lumos. The same golden light flared to life. Murmurs got louder. This time, he let the light shift, softening the intensity, then brightening again before he let it fade. You lot have been taught to think magic is rigid, he continued, stepping forward, gaze sweeping the room. That spells are these locked little boxes where if you don't get the word exactly right, it all falls apart. But it is not that fragile. Spells work because we make them work. The difference between a standard Lumos and a spell like Lumos Solemn isn't just the extra word, it is what you want it to be. The room had quieted, people actually paying attention now. A sly smile tugged at one corner of his mouth. Now circle back, why is one magic's Lumos a beacon while another is barely a candle? Wand work and pronunciation help, but comprehension is king. Facing the far wall, he drove the wand forward. Lumos. This time, the light that appeared wasn't a general glow, it was focused. Sharper. A near-perfect beam, cutting straight ahead instead of spilling everywhere. I didn't change the incantation, he said, letting it linger for a moment before extinguishing it. Didn't add a suffix. Didn't do anything different on the surface. So what happened? A pause. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a hesitant voice, you thought about it differently. Cassian snapped his fingers, pointing toward her. Exactly. I pictured a beam, not just light in general. And magic listened. Cassian carried on, talking about light, how the sun wasn't just a giant ball of it, how it moved through space, how it could bend, scatter, and shift. He threw in a few more spell variations, managing to cast them without making a complete fool of himself. Lumos Maxima flared brighter than expected, nearly blinding the front row. Lumos Duo split into twin orbs, hovering briefly before flickering out. Every time he spoke, he kept it sharp, confident, like this was all part of the plan. An hour passed. The room hadn't emptied. No one had come expecting a bloody lecture on Lumos. If they had, they wouldn't have bothered showing up. And yet, there they were, silent, actually listening. Cassian could see it in their faces. Interest. A few taking notes. A couple of smug purebloods who started out sneering but now looked vaguely impressed, like they weren't sure how this had happened. His father sat in the front row, arms crossed, face unreadable. Damien, the smug bastard, still had that amused smirk, but it wasn't quite as sharp as before. Like he was waiting for Cassian to fuck up, but it hadn't happened yet. By the time Cassian wrapped up, he knew he pulled it off. No disaster. No humiliation. He set his wand down on the podium, looking over the crowd. That is all for tonight. You are welcome. A few laughed quietly. Someone started an awkward applause, but it sputtered and died before it could spread. The second he stepped off the stage, the noise picked up, conversations, murmurs. Some sounded impressed. Others just confused. As he made his way towards the back, Damien fell into step beside him. Well, that was unexpected. Cassian rolled his eyes. Don't strain yourself with the compliments, cousin. Oh, I am not complimenting you, Damien said, trying to sound as arrogant as ever. Just surprised you didn't burst into flames from all that effort. Cassian ignored him, pushing open the door to the back room. He needed a drink. Maybe an entire bottle. He barely made it to the side table before something shifted. Not in the room. Not in the air. In his head. The floating spell list flickered. Right below Lumos, something new appeared. Lumos, successfully taught to 563 individuals. 2 ancient variations awakened. And below that, 2 new entries. Lumos Noctis, an ancient variation used by night crawlers to snuff out all light in an area, allowing them to hunt unseen. Lumos Spectaculum, an ancient variation used to manipulate light to form moving illusions, creating lifelike images or recreating historical scenes in glowing detail. Chapter 4, Teacher? Cassian's breath hitched. The moment he focused on the name, something cracked open in his mind. Not memories, at least, not his. Something older, alien. Images stabbed through his mind, cold and jagged, as if glass splintering behind his eyes. A dark forest, thick with mist that clung to his skin like cold sweat. Shapes shifted between the trees, too fast to follow, too silent to be alive. Blackened, elongated limbs moved with unnatural grace. Eyes like endless pits stared back, not glowing, but drinking in light, swallowing it until nothing remained. Around them, the air itself seemed to shudder. Shadows spilled outward, pooling like oil, suffocating the faintest glimmer of light. Stars winked out one by one above the treetops, and even the moon grew dim, its pale glow strangled as if unseen hands were snuffing it from the heavens. The magic here wasn't mere darkness. It wasn't night or shadow or anything natural. It was deeper, wrong. It pressed in, heavy and absolute, an endless suffocation. Each breath came harder, thinner, as though the air itself had been bled dry. And beneath it all came sounds, bones snapping like brittle twigs, the wet tear of flesh, and something else, a low hum, almost inaudible, vibrating in his teeth. Cassian's heart slammed against his ribs. It felt like death approaching, not the clean inevitability of time, but something hungrier, a devouring force that would leave no trace of him behind. Cassian flinched, yanking himself out of it. The room spun for a second before settling. He let out a slow breath, gripping the edge of the table. All right. That was horrifying. Also new, but mostly horrifying. His fingers twitched. He glanced at his wand. He knew better than to try it here. Whatever the hell Lumos Noctis was, it wasn't a party trick. Still, a cold feeling curled at the base of his spine. Not fear. Just the sharp awareness that something had shifted. Something had changed. And he wasn't sure if it could be undone. Cassian took a slow breath. What the hell was that? No answer, obviously. The room was as quiet as it had been a moment ago, the only sound was the faint crackle of the fireplace. He rolled his shoulders, trying to shake the lingering unease from whatever the hell that was. The second spell was still there. Lumos Spectaculum. He focused on it, expecting another weird vision. Instead, images formed in his mind, smooth and clear, like flipping through a book he hadn't realized he'd read. Scholars, illusionists, teachers, people weaving light into shapes, using it to tell stories, record history, even recreate battles in shimmering detail. No creeping dread this time. No black-eyed creatures lurking in the dark. Cassian pressed his fingers against his temples, softly rubbing. All right. So apparently, he could now pull ancient magic out of thin air. Lovely. That wasn't concerning at all. Someone knocked on his door again. Not hesitant this time or impatient, just the usual get your arse moving sort of knock. Cassian straightened. What? His father entered first, his mother following close behind. Regulus clapped a firm hand on Cassian's shoulder, his expression a rare approval and relief. That was well done, son. He said, nodding. I knew you wouldn't humiliate us. Cassian arched a brow. Not exactly a glowing review, but from Regulus Rosier, it might as well have been a standing ovation. Son. The word landed heavier than it should have. The man in front of him was technically his father now, but it was like hearing a stranger claim him. He fought the instinct to flinch, instead leaning into the performance. Didn't have much of a choice, did I? He said, shaking off Regulus's grip with a casual roll of his shoulder. If I tanked that, I would be out on my arse before the ink dried on my disownment papers. Regulus chuckled, but there was a glint in his grey eyes. He wasn't just pleased Cassian hadn't embarrassed him, he was thinking. Planning. Brilliant. That was probably worse. Perhaps you are not as entirely useless as you've spent your life proving, Regulus mused, stepping past him to pour himself a drink. You managed to hold the room. Even the purebloods were listening. That is a rare talent, Cassian. Persuasion. Cassian chuckled coldly. More like they were too shocked to leave. Thought they were tricked into a remedial class. Regardless, it worked. Regulus took a slow sip. Your ability to explain magic, even something as simple as lumos, held their attention. That is valuable. Valuable. Right. Cassian could practically hear the wheels turning in his father's head. There was always a use for things in Regulus's world. Money, power, reputation, everything was leverage, including people. And now, somehow, Cassian had made himself leverage. Ophelia, who had been standing near the door with her arms crossed, finally spoke. Pity you couldn't muster half that effort back when it might have mattered, she said, her tone as dry as an empty cauldron. Cassian turned to her, flashing a sharp grin. Ah, but mother, if I had, you would be out of excuses to act disappointed in me. Her expression didn't so much as twitch. You assume I need an excuse. Regulus set his glass down, giving Cassian a long, assessing look. I will arrange a teaching job for you at Hogwarts. Cassian blinked. You will what? Regulus didn't repeat himself. He simply held Cassian's gaze, as if daring him to argue. A laugh bubbled up before Cassian could stop it. Oh, that is brilliant. Absolutely bloody brilliant. The school that chucked me out because I couldn't manage first-year spells, now you want me teaching there? You remember that I graduated with a lot of favors, right? He gestured vaguely. What, exactly? How to disappoint your entire bloodline before 30? His mother huffed sharply, adjusting the cuffs of her robes like she would rather be anywhere else. Language, Cassian. Right, sorry. Wouldn't want to scandalize the fine, upstanding Rosier name with my vulgarity. He turned back to Regulus. But, seriously. What the hell makes you think anyone at Hogwarts would let me within a mile of a classroom? Regulus didn't even blink. Dumbledore has been more open to outside hires. And your cousins won't stop complaining about how dull history of magic is with that ghost. I believe you could make it interesting. Cassian almost laughed. Seriously? History? Again? In this life, too? He barely wrapped his head around the fact that he was in a magical world, and now he got his job back. Right, of course, he drawled, slumping into a chair and stretching his legs out. Because I am such a respected academic. What, exactly, do you think I would be teaching them? How to dodge responsibility and disappoint their parents? Regulus ignored the sarcasm. You held their attention today. That is more than most of their professors can manage. That is because they were waiting for me to humiliate myself. And yet, you didn't. Cassian's smirk twitched, but he kept his expression amused. You sound almost impressed, father. Careful, you will ruin your reputation. Regulus didn't look amused. You will take the job, he said. It will give you status, and it will put this family in a position to shape the next generation of wizards. I always thought that mind of yours would get you killed before it amounted to anything, but today, you proved me wrong. Cassian let out a slow, exaggerated sigh, slumping further into his chair. He flicked his fingers in a lazy mock toast. So, what now? I pack my bags for Hogwarts and pretend I have a clue what I am doing. Regulus sat back, fingers tapping against the armrest. You wouldn't be the first. Cassian snorted. Comforting. Returning home after the festival, Cassian pushed open his bedroom door and slumped into the chair by the window. His head hit the backrest, eyes shutting for a moment. The fresh breeze did little to ease the exhaustion settling into his bones. He pulled it off, somehow. Against all odds, he hadn't humiliated himself in front of half the bloody aristocracy. His father hadn't ripped into him, and Damien hadn't gotten his victory laugh. But instead of relief, all he felt was a dull sort of emptiness. A quiet pop snapped him out of it. A house elf stood by the door, small hands wringing together. The creature barely lifted its head, voice trembling. Do you wish anything, Master Cassian? Cassian blinked, rubbing a hand over his face. He glanced at the elf, towel, wasn't it, and shook his head. No, I am fine. Thanks. Silence. He glanced up. The elf was staring at him, mouth slightly open, eyes wide with something between awe and terror. Cassian frowned. What? Towel flinched and quickly shook its head. And nothing, Master Cassian. It bowed so low its long ears nearly touched the floor. Cassian squinted at it. That was the second time tonight an elf had reacted like he just grown a second head. The first had been before the lecture, when he apologized for startling one. The longer he looked at Towel, the stranger it felt. The thing was still shivering, its hands clenched so tight the knuckles had gone grey. Cassian didn't get it. Sure, elves were skittish, but this was different. The unease tightened in his gut. He didn't want to, but he reached into the memories of the other Cassian, the one who belonged in this body before him. A flood of images hit him like a punch to the teeth. Kicks. Punches. The sound of bones cracking. A twisted laugh. The sight of an elf curled on the ground, sobbing, while Cassian, no, not him, the old Cassian, loomed over it, a stick pointed like a weapon. He swallowed, throat tight. Bloody hell! This bastard! No wonder Towel looked like it was waiting to be skinned alive. His stomach turned. What a bastard! His fingers curled into the armrest, jaw tightening. He wasn't a saint, but this was pathetic. Kicking around creatures that couldn't fight back, who flinched at the mere sight of him. Towel still stood there, visibly shaking. Cassian forced his expression into something neutral, though it took effort. You can go. The elf hesitated, eyes darting up to meet his before snapping back down. Then, with another pop, it vanished. He raked a hand through his hair. Fucking brilliant. He was stuck in the life of a sadistic little shit with a reputation worse than his magic. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the rising moon. The sight did nothing to take the edge off. Sleep didn't come easy. His body was exhausted, but his mind kept circling back to everything, the lecture, the spells, the weird thing floating in his head, and now, the delightful discovery that the old Cassian had been the magical equivalent of a rich kid who set ants on fire for fun. By the time he actually drifted off, it felt like barely a minute had passed before knocking jolted him awake. Cassian groaned into his pillow. Go away. The knocking didn't stop. He peeled an eye open, glaring at the door. For fuck's sake! Dragging himself up, he swung his legs over the bed and shuffled over, yanking it open. The door swung open, and there stood Lucian. He barely spared Cassian a glance before stepping inside, exuding the same effortless authority he always carried. Grandfather wants to see you, he said, his voice clipped. Then, with a quick up and down look, his lip curled. Freshen up. And wear something decent for once. Cassian rubbed a hand down his face, still groggy. Brilliant. Just what I needed first thing in the morning. A family reunion. Lucian didn't bother acknowledging that. He just stood there, waiting, like he fully expected Cassian to crawl out and obey. Cassian rolled his shoulders with exaggerated sluggishness. You know, if you ever got cursed into a mirror, you would make an excellent dressing assistant. Maybe even land a job. Lucian didn't rise to the bait. Be ready in 10. He turned on his heel and left without waiting for a response. Cassian shut the door, exhaling through his nose. Grandfather wanted to see him. That couldn't mean anything good. Magnus Rosier wasn't the sort to waste time, and he certainly wasn't the sort to call for Cassian unless there was a very specific reason. And if Lucian's presence was anything to go by, this wasn't just about the lecture. Cassian dragged himself to the wash basin, splashing cold water on his face. The mirror above it reflected back the same tired, half-irritated expression he always wore around family. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to make himself look somewhat presentable, then grabbed a set of robes that weren't completely wrinkled. Chapter 5, Lucian Rosier. By the time Cassian stepped out of his room, Lucian was already waiting in the hall, arms crossed, looking impatient. Cassian smirked. What? No applause. I set a new personal best for Rosier dignity in under 5 minutes. Lucian didn't even blink. Try not to embarrass yourself in front of grandfather. Cassian offered a mock salute. Oh, I will do my best to live down to expectations. The walk to Magnus' study was quiet. Cassian could feel Lucian's eyes on him, the same assessing look he always wore, like he was trying to figure out whether Cassian was worth acknowledging today. Eventually, Lucian spoke. Where did you read about light? Cassian blinked. What? The way you explained lumos at the lecture. Lucian glanced at him, sharp and expectant. Intent, knowledge, interpretation. That wasn't from Hogwarts curriculum. So where did you pull it from? Cassian exhaled through his nose, stalling for a second. Books, he said vaguely. Lucian scoffed. You don't read. That is offensive, Cassian muttered. I will have you know I read plenty. Just not the dry, soul-crushing nonsense you lot enjoy. Lucian didn't let it drop. Which books? Cassian could practically feel the noose tightening. Various ones, he said, still keeping it as vague as possible. Picked up bits and pieces here and there. Just because I am not a dueling prodigy like you doesn't mean I am thick. Lucian's eyes narrowed slightly. Cassian threw him a look. What, are you actually interested? Didn't think you cared about anything outside of hexing people into the floor. Lucian ignored that. If you had an actual source, I want to know it. Cassian chuckled. So you can take credit for it. Lucian didn't even flinch. If it is useful, then yes. Cassian let out a low chuckle. Honest. I almost respect it. Lucian stopped outside the heavy oak doors of Magnus' study. Don't waste his time, he said. Then, after a brief pause, added, and don't try your little lecture hall theatrics in there. This isn't a room of half-bloods hungry for novelty. This is grandfather. Cassian gave a smile. Ah, you do care. Lucian knocked once, then pushed open the door without waiting for a response. Inside, Magnus Rosier sat behind his massive desk, his silvered black hair neatly combed back, piercing blue eyes watching them the moment they entered. Next to him, Grandmother Catherine sat upright in her chair, her expression as sharp as ever. Cassian swallowed a sigh. Letting it out would only earn him another lecture on posture or respect or whatever else passed for virtue in this mausoleum of a family. Grandfather, Lucian said smoothly, stepping aside to let Cassian in first. Magnus gestured to the chair across from him. Sit. Cassian did, slouching slightly just to be irritating. Your lecture, Magnus said, studying him. Was unexpected. Cassian spread his hands. I like to keep people on their toes. Magnus wasn't amused. Where did you learn that approach? Cassian felt Lucian's eyes on him again. He shrugged, keeping his expression loose. Like I told our dear prodigal son, books. Thought I might as well make use of something in this family's massive library. Didn't realize we had an Inquisition department monitoring my reading habits now. Catherine's lips pressed together. Don't be flippant. Cassian arched a brow. Wouldn't dream of it. Magnus leaned back slightly, still watching him. You spoke as though you had studied magic beyond your own abilities. Cassian's jaw clenched briefly, but he kept his tone light. Well, it is not like my own abilities were going to impress anyone. Figured I might as well say something interesting instead. Magnus didn't react immediately. His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest of his chair. Then, finally, he spoke. You will continue teaching. Regulus has arranged for you to take a position. Cassian fought the urge to roll his eyes. Not like I have other options, right? Magnus didn't acknowledge the sarcasm. You do not. Teaching history is one thing, but your real task is to find capable young wizards, those who can be shaped and brought into the family's fold after graduation. You have a way with words, use it. Cassian let out a slow breath, fingers tapping against the armrest, syncing with Magnus. Right. Recruit impressionable students into the Grand Rosier legacy. Sounds like a thrilling way to spend my time. Spare me the attitude, Magnus said, cool as ever. You wanted a place in this family. This is it. Cassian didn't bother arguing. He wasn't stupid. His grandfather wasn't just throwing him a lifeline, this was a test, another chance to prove he wasn't completely useless. Or at least useful enough to keep around. Catherine, who had been watching him with the same mild distaste she always did, finally spoke. For once in your life, try not to embarrass us. Cassian tilted his head. We'll fight for the chance, grandmother. She gave him a sharp look but said nothing more. Lucian, who had been silent until now, finally moved. If you are going to be representing the family at Hogwarts, you should at least look the part. I will have the tailors update your wardrobe. Cassian raised an eyebrow. Fantastic. Can't wait to be dressed like a proper Rosier puppet. Lucian didn't react, just gave a faint sniff like Cassian wasn't worth the effort of a response. Magnus waved his hand, signaling the conversation was done. You leave in 4 weeks. Make use of the time. Cassian gave a lazy salute. Understood, grandfather. His grandfather watched him a moment longer, then nodded. Dismissed. Cassian didn't need to be told twice. He got up and strolled out, Lucian following a step behind. You can stop looming, Cassian muttered as they walked down the hall. Lucian ignored that. Do you even understand what is being given to you? Oh, absolutely. The grand privilege of lecturing brats while keeping an eye out for promising blood. Lucian's jaw tightened slightly. Try not to make a mess of it. You are representing all of us, whether you like it or not. Cassian shot him a look. Touching concern, coming from you. Lucian said nothing. Just shook his head and walked off, leaving Cassian alone in the hall. 4 weeks. Then he would be shipped off to Hogwarts to play professor. Brilliant. The days leading up to his departure were filled with the usual suffocating routine, dinners where his existence was barely tolerated, endless reminders of what was expected of him, and the occasional passive-aggressive remark from Lucian about how not to disgrace the family. Cassian avoided his family as much as possible in the weeks before he left. His father had handed him a stack of history books, mostly propaganda, rewritten to make the Rosiers and their allies look like untouchable legends. He barely glanced at them before shoving them into a drawer. If he was going to teach history, he needed real books. Ones that didn't read like a pure-blood recruitment pamphlet. So, he went to Diagon Alley. Flourish and Blots had the usual drivel, but he managed to find a few decent volumes on wizarding history tucked between the more politically acceptable narratives. That wasn't enough, though. He spent hours in libraries, digging through anything he could get his hands on, old magical treaties, battle records, even a few dusty scrolls no one had touched in decades. History had been his bread and butter in another life, lecturing, debating, digging into dead men's mistakes until even the dullest room woke up. He wasn't about to half-arse it now just because there were wands involved. Magic left marks, on places, on people, on history itself. Wars weren't just fought with swords and spells, they were fought over bloodlines, old alliances, curses woven into family trees. This world had a past that most people barely understood, and he wanted to know it. Not that he had much time for quiet research. His family found plenty of ways to make his life miserable. His mother, Ophelia, never said much to him, but the few times she did, it was just to remind him not to make a fool of himself. Lucian, as usual, was a constant shadow, watching him with that same cool disapproval, like he was waiting for Cassian to do something ridiculous. Regulus, at least, was satisfied. Not pleased, but satisfied. That was the best Cassian was going to get. His father had arranged his teaching position, and now it was on him to make it work, or fail and be cast out completely. When the day finally came, Cassian packed what little he actually cared about, a few books, a decent stash of money, and, for some god-forsaken reason, the old Cassian's wand. He thought about leaving it behind. It wasn't like it had done him much good. But something about it felt important, like throwing it away would be admitting something he wasn't ready to face. Lucian and Damien were waiting by the flue. Try not to disgrace us too quickly, Damien said, smoothing his robe. Give it a week at least. Maybe 2. Cassian flashed him a grin. Don't worry, cousin. I will make sure my first scandal is truly spectacular. Lucian only shook his head, handed him a small envelope and strode away. Cassian opened it and found a simple letter, stamped with the Hogwarts crest. Professor Cassian Rosier. He huffed a quiet laugh. Looks official. Lucian gave him a long look. Don't waste this. Cassian met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Then he stepped into the flue, tossed down the powder, and muttered, Hogwarts. The world twisted, blurred, and then he stepped out into Dumbledore's office. The place was as strange as he expected, full of odd, whirring contraptions, shelves lined with books, and an air of controlled chaos. Behind the massive desk, Albus Dumbledore himself sat, hands folded, blue eyes twinkling with that infuriating knowing look. Professor Rosier, Dumbledore said warmly. Welcome to Hogwarts. Cassian shook the old man's hand, offering a polite smile. Thanks for the warm welcome. Dumbledore's grip was firm but light, his expression unreadable except for that usual twinkle in his eye, like he was in on some joke no one else knew. Cassian was sure he recognized the name, but the details were a mess. Old Cassian's memories painted him as a big deal, someone important, but from his own past life? The name barely rang a bell. Just another figure he hadn't paid attention to. Dumbledore studied him, that knowing look still in place. Cassian ignored it. If the old man wanted to play his little games, fine. He wasn't going to be the first one to flinch. So, Professor Rosier, Dumbledore said, settling back in his chair. It's been some time since you last walked these halls. Chapter 6, Professor Rosier. So, Professor Rosier, Dumbledore said, settling back in his chair. It's been some time since you last walked these halls. Not nearly. Cassian muttered before catching himself. He cleared his throat, forcing a smile. Yes. A while. Dumbledore's lips curled upward. You were quite the student. If I recall correctly, your attendance record was creative. Cassian tilted his head. I prefer to think of it as prioritizing. Of course. The twinkle in Dumbledore's eye brightened. And now, you've chosen to return in an entirely new capacity. A fascinating turn of events. Chosen is a strong word, Cassian said, getting comfortable in his seat. Let's say I was strongly encouraged. Ah, Dumbledore mused, fingers steepled. Family expectations, I presume. Cassian scoffed. You could say that. Apparently, I am not entirely useless if I can stand in front of a room and talk without drooling. I suspect there is more to it than that, Dumbledore said, his tone light but watchful. Your summer festival lecture caused quite a stir, Professor Rosier. Many experienced wizards understand the importance of intent, visualization, and mental imagery when casting spells. But your take on spell variation, relying on mindset rather than suffixes, was new to me as well. I must admit, I've always used incantation modifiers for variations. But after your lecture, I tested your theory, and, as you pointed out, the extra words were unnecessary. Cassian bit back a grin. Right. As if the greatest living wizard had never noticed that loophole before. The old man was being gracious, letting him keep the spotlight. Cassian arched a brow. So, what you are saying is, I taught Albus Dumbledore a new trick. And they say you can't teach new tricks to, learned, distinguished gentlemen. Dumbledore chuckled softly, that infuriating glint in his eyes as though he already knew the punchline to a joke Cassian hadn't heard yet. A rather humbling experience, I assure you. Cassian wasn't expecting that. Not because he thought Dumbledore was above learning, clearly, the old man had spent a lifetime doing just that, but because most wizards wouldn't bother re-examining something as basic as Lumos. They just did what worked and never questioned why. Well, glad to be of service, Cassian said. But I have to say, if you were testing out spell mechanics based on my half-baked ramblings, you must have been terribly bored. Dumbledore's smile was faint. On the contrary, I found your perspective refreshing. It is rare to hear magic discussed in such terms, particularly from a young wizard. Cassian slumped deeper into his chair. Fake it till you make it, right? Hopefully, the students enjoy my lessons. Last I checked, history of magic was just a convenient excuse for a nap. Dumbledore's smile widened. Yes, Professor Bin's lectures do have that effect. Many students find themselves resting their eyes, though I suspect few actually intend to sleep through the entire lesson. He tilted his head slightly. I am curious, how do you plan to make it more engaging? Cassian shrugged, the ideas almost made him go hee-hee, but he covered it with a cough. Well, considering I spent most of my school years perfecting the art of looking awake while being anything but, I think I have an advantage. If nothing else, I know exactly what not to do. Dumbledore's amusement didn't fade. A promising start, I must say. History is not the problem, Cassian continued, drumming his fingers against the armrest. It is how it is taught. Just dates and names thrown at students until it all blends together. No wonder half of them would rather drool on their desks. He leaned forward slightly. History isn't dates and dusty names, right? It is about why. Who pulled the strings? Who bled for it? Who got rich while everyone else rotted? That is what matters. That is what makes it interesting. Dumbledore nodded, considering him. A perspective that few educators take. Most prefer the safety of neutral storytelling. Neutral is just the polite word for boring, Cassian drawled, flicking his fingers dismissively. Besides, history is never neutral. Every story depends on who is telling it. Even in Why Our World. Dumbledore's expression sharpened ever so slightly. Indeed. Cassian didn't miss the shift but didn't comment on it. Instead, he stretched his legs out a little. I am not planning to turn this into a political debate every lesson, don't worry. But if they leave my class actually remembering something other than the year of the Goblin Rebellions, I will call it a win. A noble goal, Dumbledore mused. And one I believe you may achieve, given the right approach. He gestured toward the desk, where a folder sat neatly atop a stack of books. Your schedule, class lists, and curriculum guidelines. I suspect you may find them flexible. Cassian lifted an eyebrow, reaching for the folder. Flexible as in we trust you to handle it, or flexible as in figure it out yourself? A bit of both, I imagine. Cassian flipped open the folder and schemed the student list. Plenty of familiar names. Weasleys, Rosiers, a few other pure-blood families that had been clinging to relevance for generations. But no Harry Potter. His brow twitched slightly. That was the only name he actually knew from the books. Well, knew was a strong word. It was plastered all over the world once, enough to gather that the kid was important, but beyond that? Nothing. No idea if he was supposed to be here yet, if he'd already come and gone, or if this was some completely different timeline where Potter had never existed in the first place. No wait, old Cassian remembers the boy who had killed their lord. Not that it really mattered. He had enough to deal with without worrying about some boy who may or may not have been famous in a story he never read. He flipped another page, scheming schedules, lesson plans, well, loose guidelines, at best. Dumbledore wasn't lying about the flexibility. Half of it was just, cover major events and figures. Don't bore them to death. Solid advice. Cassian leaned back in his chair. So, just to be clear, I can teach however I want, as long as no one sets fire to the classroom. Dumbledore chuckled. An accurate, if simplified, understanding. Brilliant. He shut the folder. Anything else I need to know, or can I start traumatizing students immediately? Dumbledore laughed. I imagine you will find Hogwarts much the same as you left it. Cassian doubted that. Old Cassian had spent most of his school years avoiding anything that required effort, and now he was expected to stand at the front of a classroom and act like an authority on something. Well, he was an authority. Just not in the way they thought. He stood, shaking Dumbledore's hand. Guess I will see you at the next staff meeting, or in detention. I am nothing if not versatile. Let's hope for the former. Dumbledore smiled, as the old man's eyes glint again. Cassian didn't know if it was magic or some sort of brilliance of an old master seeping through. He ignored it, nodding before heading out. The corridors were just as he remembered, stone, portraits, the occasional ghost floating about like they had nowhere better to be. It was surreal, walking through the place again, this time as a professor. He wondered how many of the old staff were still around. Probably McGonagall. She seemed too stubborn to die. Reaching his quarters, he found his luggage already inside. House elves, probably. He shut the door behind him and sighed. All right. Time to figure out how the hell he was going to pull this off. As he sat, Cassian closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to the list. And then, he nearly choked. Lumos, first year spell, maximum mastery. What? The last time he checked, it was sitting at insufficient mastery, creeping up slowly as the lecture went on. But now? Maximum mastery. That wasn't normal. Hell, he wasn't normal, but this? Something wasn't adding up. He rubbed his temple, going over it again. He didn't suddenly become some prodigy at spellcasting overnight, he knew that much. His Lumos was barely holding together a few weeks back. No sudden spark of genius, no months of secret training. So why the hell was it maxed out now? Unless... His mind jumped back to the lecture. The crowd. The way they'd been hanging on to every word, actually trying the spells. Could it be that? Cassian frowned. He never heard of magic working like that. Normally, if someone taught a spell, the student got better, not the teacher. That was just common sense. But here he was, staring at undeniable proof that something weird was going on. Maybe it was some kind of shared effect? Magic responding to the fact that over 100 people had learned Lumos through him? It didn't make much sense, but neither did half the things he'd seen in this world so far. He tapped his fingers against the armrest, thinking. If that was the case, then, what? Every time he taught a spell and someone learned it, he mastered it completely? That was ridiculous. But so was waking up in a body that wasn't his, so was pulling lost spells out of thin air, so was everything. He took a deep breath. If it was connected to teaching, then he had a way forward. An advantage. He just had to figure out how far it went. Would it work on any spell? Did the number of people learning matter? If one person learned a spell from him, would that be enough? No way to know without testing it. And lucky him, he had an entire school full of students about to be forced to listen to him. Cassian snorted, shaking his head. Well, guess I am about to be the best history of magic professor this place has ever seen. You stand before the mirror. It shows you. Cassian, holding a glowing power stone. Behind him, Bath's Haida babbling smiles approvingly. You reach for the reflection. It laughs. You don't even have one, Cassian says. Hey! Just a quick heads up, the little end of chapter notes I add here are meant to be light-hearted and joking. I originally started doing them in another FIC where the tone was already set, so most of my returning readers know not to take them seriously. But I realize for someone new, they might come across differently. Please know there is no intent to insult or talk down, I just like to add a bit of silliness at the end. Chapter 7, New Year begins. A sharp knock at the door dragged him back to reality. Enter, he called, stretching his legs out. The door swung open, and a familiar, unwelcome face strolled in. Professor Rosier, Severus Snape said, voice dripping with something between mild disdain and professional disinterest. Cassian took his time responding, giving the man a once-over. Snape looked exactly as he remembered, tall, sallow-skinned, perpetually pissed off at existence. Professor Snape. Cassian gave a mock shiver, then grinned wide. Old Cassian had despised Snape, and the feeling had been very much mutual. But now? Now, they were colleagues. Equals. If that wasn't the funniest thing to happen all year, he didn't know what was. How money could change things. He, the absolute failure of his generation, who had bribed classmates to do his homework, paid off exam boards, and spent a small fortune making sure his O.W.L.S. and N.E.W.T.S. weren't a complete disaster, was now a professor at Hogwarts. Cassian Rosier, the student who barely scraped by, was now expected to teach the next generation about history. Utterly absurd and delightful. Snape, of course, wasn't amused. He stood in the doorway, black robes hanging like a funeral shroud, arms crossed, looking at Cassian like he was an unpleasant stain on his floor. Professor Snape, Cassian returned, throwing himself back into his chair, arms draped over the armrests like he owned the place. Wait, he did. What an absolute pleasure. I was just thinking, what is missing from my day, and then, poof. Here you are. Snape didn't react. Didn't frown, didn't sneer, just looked at him, the way someone might look at a particularly unremarkable insect. I see Hogwarts has lowered its standards. Cassian barked out a laugh. Oh, Severus, don't be so dramatic. We both know standards were never the issue. Just connections. He crossed one ankle over the other, settling in. You and I both know I didn't get this job because of my, academic brilliance. Snape's lip curled ever so slightly. No, I suspect not. Cassian smirked. Good to see we understand each other. Snape stepped further into the room. Regardless of how you obtained this position, you are expected to behave as a professor. That means no gambling, no drinking in the Great Hall, and no corrupting the students. Cassian placed a hand over his chest, looking scandalized. Severus, please, I would never. He let his hand drop and chuckled. Besides, let's not pretend you haven't benefited from a bit of nepotism yourself. Last I checked, you were quite close to the Dark Lord. And now, head of Slytherin. It is almost like connections matter, isn't it? Snape's expression didn't change, but Cassian didn't miss the sharp flicker of irritation in his dark eyes. Old Cassian had known, of course. His father made sure the family was well aware of Snape's place in the hierarchy, how he had been favored, how every Rosier was expected to keep on his good side. Not that Cassian particularly cared about the man's past allegiances. He just enjoyed being a pain in the arse. Snape folded his arms, unimpressed. Whatever advantages I have, I earn through skill, not family favors. Cassian drummed a fingertip on the armrest. Sure, sure. And I am here purely on merit. Let's both pretend, shall we? He gave an exaggerated wink. Now, since I doubt you came here just to welcome me with open arms, what do you actually want? Snape's nostrils flared, the closest he came to admitting a mistake. I came to remind you that while you may have fooled the headmaster into believing you are competent, you will not disrupt my house with whatever nonsense you think passes for teaching. Cassian smiled brightly. Oh, don't worry. I have no interest in corrupting your precious Slytherins. Unless, of course, they ask nicely. Snape's lip curled. Just stay out of my way, Rosier. He turned on his heel, black robes billowing dramatically as he made for the door. Cassian couldn't resist. Severus. Snape paused, shoulders stiff. Cassian tilted his head, all fake innocence. Did you practice that robe thing in the mirror, or does it come naturally? Snape left without another word, but Cassian swore he saw his fingers twitch, like he was resisting the urge to hex him on the spot. Once the door shut, Cassian let out a slow breath. Right. That was one reunion down. A whole castle full to go. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Teaching at Hogwarts. It still didn't feel real. The last time he was here, he was the least promising Rosier in generations. A near-Squib. A failure. And now, somehow, he was supposed to stand at the front of a classroom and act like he knew what he was doing. It would have been a joke, except he wasn't actually bad at teaching. Not in his last life, and not at the festival, apparently. The lecture on Lumos worked too well, if the strange spell list in his head was anything to go by. He closed his eyes and focused. Lumos, first year spell, maximum mastery. Still there. Still maxed out. And those two variations, the ones that came from nowhere. He didn't dare test Lumos Noctis yet. Whatever that spell was, it didn't come from a friendly place. But Lumos Spectaculum, that one had possibilities. Cassian tapped his fingers against the armrest. If the interface, or whatever it was, really did boost his mastery every time he taught a spell, then that meant he had a way to improve. A way to actually become competent at magic. He just had to keep teaching. A slow grin spread across his face. Oh, this was going to be fun. In the evening, a house elf appeared and informed Cassian that the students were arriving. He was expected at the staff table. He rubbed a hand over his face. Right. Time to go play professor. He set aside the book he had been flipping through and stood, stretching out the stiffness in his shoulders. The start of term feast. A grand Hogwarts tradition. He had vague memories of it from his own school days, mostly of being bored out of his mind while Dumbledore rambled and students cheered over floating candles and magically refilling goblets. The corridors were already bustling by the time he made his way toward the Great Hall. Ghosts drifted through the walls, chattering about the new batch of first years. A few older students passed him, shooting curious glances his way. Most of them didn't recognize him, though some of the Slytherins whispered his name under their breath. Probably recalling his surname rather than his actual existence. The Rosiers were well known. Cassian, less so, and if he was remembered, it was for all the wrong reasons. The doors to the Great Hall were open, light spilling into the corridor. Inside, the longhouse tables stretched beneath the enchanted ceiling, which mirrored the twilight sky. The buzz of conversation filled the space, students settling into their seats while staff were already gathered at the high table. Cassian slipped in, ignoring the way a few heads turned his way. He dropped into his assigned seat, which, because of course it was right between Severus Snape and Professor Bath's Hada babbling. Snape barely acknowledged his existence, which suited Cassian just fine. Babbling gave him a polite nod before returning to her conversation with Professors Vector and Sinistra. Cassian remembered all three from his student days. Dumbledore sat at the center, surveying the hall like some ancient deity overseeing a feast. Beside him, McGonagall's seat was empty, probably out preparing students for the sorting to begin. Cassian watched as the doors opened once more. The first years trickled in, looking appropriately overwhelmed. Their gazes darted between the floating candles, the house banners, the vast enchanted ceiling. The sorting hat sat at the front, waiting. McGonagall stepped forward, scroll in hand. When I call your name, you will come forward, place the sorting hat upon your head, and be sorted into your house. The process began. One by one, names were called, and the nervous 11-year-olds shuffled forward. The hat announced their fates, and each house erupted into cheers accordingly. Angelina Johnson. Gryffindor. Adrian Pusey. Slytherin. Cedric Diggory. Hufflepuff. Cassian watched, only half interested, until the last student was sorted. The hat was removed, McGonagall returned to her seat, and Dumbledore rose to give his traditional welcome speech. Welcome, welcome. To our returning students, I say, welcome back. To our new students, welcome to Hogwarts. The start of term is always a time of great excitement, and this year shall be no exception. Cassian tuned most of it out. The usual nonsense about house unity, the importance of learning, the do not enter the Forbidden Forest warning that was, without fail, ignored by at least a dozen students each year. Dumbledore gestured toward his right, where a woman sat with a composed air, her robes an elegant deep green. Unfortunately, Professor Patricia Rakepick has resigned from the post of Defense Against the Dark Arts. In her place, we welcome Professor Helena Mulford. Cassian glanced over. Mulford had sharp, angular features, the kind that made her look like she was always on the verge of disapproval. Her hair was pinned back neatly. Mulford raised her head slightly, lips pressed thin. She had the look of someone who would duel a student for sloppy wand work and then mark their hospital stay as a valuable learning experience. Dumbledore's sharp blue gaze flicked toward him, and Cassian felt the faint prickle of every eye in the room following. Here it comes. And now, a new addition to our staff. Taking up the position of History of Magic, please welcome Professor Cassian Rosier. Chapter 8, First Lesson. Cassian leaned back in his chair, waving lazily as Dumbledore introduced him. Pleasure. The hall responded with murmurs, whispers, and not-so-subtle nudges. He caught a few familiar expressions among the older Slytherins. Recognition, mild curiosity, and in one or two cases, barely concealed amusement. They knew him. Wonderful. The Gryffindor table, on the other hand, had a few particularly unimpressed faces. A group of redheads, Weasleys, obviously, exchanged glances before one muttered something that earned quiet snickers. Cassian had a fairly solid guess on the contents. Mulford barely spared him a glance before returning to whatever quiet thoughts she was brooding over. Snape, seated beside him, didn't even look his way. Probably pretending he wasn't there at all. Cassian smirked to himself. Oh yes, this year was going to be a bloody circus, and he had front row seats. Dumbledore carried on with the usual notices, reminders about Filch's ever-growing list of banned items, and the fact that anyone caught trying to sneak into the kitchens after hours would be dealt with accordingly. None of it was particularly new, but the first years hung on to every word like he was revealing the secrets of the universe. Once the speech wrapped up, the food appeared, and the hall erupted into its usual feast-time chaos. Cassian reached for a goblet, sipping as everyone settled for the feast. Quite the reaction, Babbling murmured, cutting into her meal. Cassian tilted his head. Oh. She didn't glance up, but there was a trace of amusement in her tone. The students seem intrigued. Cassian flicked his gaze toward the tables. A few students still cast looks his way, though most had moved on to more pressing concerns, namely, stuffing their faces. I imagine it is not every day someone with my stellar academic history lands a teaching job, he said. Reaching for bread. She smiled faintly. It does raise some questions. A little mystery does wonders for the reputation, Cassian said lightly. Makes them nervous. Keeps them awake. She gave him a sidelong glance before shaking her head, returning to her meal. Across the hall, the first years gawked like they'd stumbled into Olympus, while the older students slid back into their little tribes. The rest of the feast passed without much incident, aside from Peeves attempting to dump an entire pitcher of pumpkin juice onto a group of unsuspecting first years. Filch lost his mind over it, but Dumbledore waved the poltergeist off like a mildly misbehaving pet, and things returned to normal soon enough. Eventually, the plates cleared, and the students were dismissed to their dormitories. Cassian lingered only to avoid looking eager to leave, then slipped away as the staff filtered out. The halls felt different now. He walked these corridors before, but never like this. As a student, he spent most of his time avoiding actual responsibilities. Now, he was expected to be the one keeping students in line. Life was funny like that. Cassian sorted his things quickly, keeping it simple. Books on the shelves, spare robes in the wardrobe, quills and parchment stacked neatly on the desk. Once everything was in place, he went through his usual routine, washing up, changing, making sure he didn't look like he'd just rolled out of a ditch. By the time he got into bed, the castle had settled into its usual late-night quiet. The distant rumble of moving staircases, the occasional hoot of an owl, the soft flicker of torchlight against the stone walls, it all felt strangely familiar, yet strange. He closed his eyes. The job wasn't the problem. The magic was. The floating list in his head, the spell mastery, the fact that teaching seemed to make him stronger, none of it made sense. But if Hogwarts was good for anything, it was giving him plenty of opportunities to figure it out. The next day, classes began. Cassian woke early, washed up, and dressed without dragging his feet about it. Whatever else he wasn't a slob. His robes were crisp, his hair neat. Despite what most assumed, he wasn't a complete mess. Lazy? Absolutely. But when it came to teaching, he didn't half-arse it. Always on time, always planned, always ready. In his last life, history had been his thing, and teaching it had been the only job he ever actually enjoyed. This time wouldn't be any different. The castle was already stirring by the time he left his quarters. A few ghosts muttered greetings or cast him wary looks, still undecided about what to make of the new professor. Some threw him downright ugly glances, after all, he had taken Professor Bin's job. The old ghost was still moaning about it to anyone with ears. He ignored them all and made his way toward the Great Hall. Inside, students were trickling in, yawning and shuffling to their seats. The enchanted ceiling showed a grey morning sky, clouds heavy with the promise of rain. The scent of fresh bread, eggs, and roasted tomatoes filled the air, blending with the usual low murmur of conversation. Cassian dropped into his seat at the staff table, pouring himself a cup of tea. "Good morning, Professor Rosier," Babbling said, offering a polite nod. Cassian raised his cup slightly. "Morning." Other side of him, Flitwick was already deep in conversation with Vector about some arithmancy diagrams. Sprout was chatting with Ketlebin, who looked far too excited for this hour. Snape, of course, was ignoring everyone. McGonagall rose from her seat, straight-backed as ever. A reminder to all students, classes begin promptly after breakfast. First years, follow your prefects. Schedules will be handed out shortly. A few groans from the Gryffindor table. Ravenclaws were already pulling out parchment. Hufflepuffs looked like they'd been awake for hours. Slytherins just nodded like they already knew the entire week's lesson plan. Cassian glanced at his own schedule. First class. Third year Gryffindor and Slytherin. Should be fun. Breakfast went by quickly. As the students started filing out, Cassian downed the rest of his tea and stood. Time to teach. His classroom was on the third floor, tucked away from the noisier parts of the castle. When he arrived, the door was open, and a few students were already inside, loitering near the back. Cassian stepped in, letting the door swing shut behind him. The students turned at the sound, some straightening up like they'd been caught doing something they weren't supposed to. "Find your seats," he said, walking to the desk. "Unless you would rather stand for the whole lesson. Your choice." Chairs scraped against the floor as they scrambled to sit. The classroom wasn't anything special, rows of desks, a blackboard, a few old maps on the walls. Dust still clung to some of the shelves, remnants of Bin's complete lack of physical presence. Cassian leaned against the desk and glanced over the room. Third years. Gryffindors and Slytherins. He tapped the desk. Right. History of magic. Probably the subject most of you plan to sleep through. A few nervous chuckles. One or two guilty looks. Cassian grinned. Can't blame you. Professor Bin's made it about as exciting as watching paint dry. But since I am not a ghost. He tapped his chest, and I don't intend to bore myself to death, we are doing things differently. Percy Weasley raised a hand. Differently how? Cassian shrugged. We are actually going to learn something useful. Someone near the back muttered, that will be a first. Cassian's eyes flicked to them. A Slytherin. Warrington. Oh? Got a problem with history, Warrington? The boy hesitated, then smirked. Just never found much use for it. Cassian pushed off the desk, stretching his arms out like he was settling in for a casual chat rather than a lecture. I can't blame you, he said. History is just a collection of glorified stories picked by the winners. Two sad truths about it. 1. The victors always write it. If Binns hasn't had some great awakening since my time here, I assume most of you have had the pleasure of hearing his version of the Goblin Wars. A few students laughed, some nodding. Yeah, well, first, he actually fought in that war, so he is biased. Second, wizards won, so the recorded history is ours. Not exactly objective. Cassian tilted his head. And the second sad thing about history? Most people don't know what to do with it. But it is a lot more useful than you think. Warrington scoffed. Not if you plan to do anything practical. Cassian shot him a look. Practical, is it? Tell me, Warrington, what do you plan to do after Hogwarts? Join the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, he said, with all the smug confidence of a boy who thought he had it all figured out. Cassian nodded. Right. And you think they don't care about history? They care about law, not stories, Warrington shot back. Cassian chuckled. You don't think history and law go hand in hand? Tell me, who wrote the laws you plan to enforce? Warrington hesitated. Cassian pressed on. The Ministry. A governing body built on the foundations of magical history. Every law, every policy, every bit of legal precedent you will be studying. It all comes from historical events, conflicts, and, shockingly, winners deciding what gets remembered. You walk into a courtroom waving a law around, and if you don't know why it exists, you are at the mercy of someone who does. You think the best orators, the best lawyers, the best enforcers don't study history? They eat it for breakfast. Because knowing where something comes from means knowing how to bend it. Silence. Cassian let them stew for a second before continuing. That is just law. What about business? Politics? Healing? Even bloody Quidditch? He pointed at Oliver Wood, who blinked, hiding the pitch book under his desk. You lot ever wonder why some teams have rivalries going back centuries? Why certain games are more brutal than others? Why some teams refuse to hire players from specific regions? Wood hesitated, brow furrowed. I mean, it is just tradition, isn't it? Cassian grinned. Right. Tradition. And what is tradition? Wood blinked again. History, Cassian said simply. Every so-called tradition is rooted in some event, some grudge, some deal made 100 years ago that people are still clinging to. You think Quidditch teams play rough just because they feel like it? Some of those grudges are older than this castle itself. A few more students looked intrigued now, leaning in just slightly. Good. Cassian turned back to Warrington. Still think history is useless? The boy muttered something under his breath and looked away. Cassian clapped his hands together. Right, now that we established history isn't just bedtime stories for dusty old wizards, let's start with something simple. He leaned back against the desk, scanning the class. Who is the greatest wizard in history? A few students blinked, as if trying to figure out if this was a trick question, but the answer was obvious. Merlin, they called out, nearly in unison. Cassian nodded. Right. Merlin. Cassian's wand flicked, and threads of golden light wove themselves into the air, nodding, twisting. The students' murmurs turned to stunned silence as a moving image appeared before them, Merlin, robed and bearded, standing beside a golden-armored Arthur. It wasn't still like a painting, nor choppy like a wizarding photograph. It flowed, smooth and lifelike, a silent projection of a scene straight from legend. He didn't know what Merlin had actually looked like, no one did, well perhaps Sorting Hat, but he wasn't about to let that stop him. His mind pulled from the only references he had, those grainy TV shows and old illustrations from his past life. Close enough. Chapter 9, The Witch. Cassian was using Lumos Spectaculum, silently, of course. The interface had bumped his mastery to maximum, so no need for incantations anymore. The moment he saw the spell, he knew exactly what to do with it, his classes. Threads of light twisted and knotted in the air, resolving into crisp details. Merlin's robe rippling in a phantom wind, Arthur's sword catching a golden gleam. The illusion breathed, moved, smooth as flowing water. The students stared, slack-jawed, some leaning forward, knuckles white against their desks. What? Someone started. That is not a painting. It is like a Muggle film. He gave them a second to soak it in before he spoke. Now, who is Merlin? And why did he side with Arthur? The projected image of Merlin flickered slightly, the aged wizard standing beside a golden-armored Arthur, his expression thoughtful, almost amused. The Weasley boy, Percy, had that eager, academic gleam in his eye. Come on, this isn't a trick question. Everyone says Merlin is the greatest wizard of all time, why? A Slytherin girl raised her hand. Because he was the most powerful wizard of his time. Cassian tilted his head. That is the usual answer, yet. But let's dig into that. What made him powerful? She hesitated, then said, his magic. Cassian clicked his tongue. Obvious. But power alone doesn't make someone great. Grindelwald was powerful. So was Voldemort. Didn't make them saints, but it sure made them memorable. Power alone doesn't write history, it is how you wield it. A few students stiffened at the name, but he ignored them. Merlin wasn't just powerful, he was influential. He didn't just hoard magic for himself, he shaped how magics interacted with Muggles. His alliance with Arthur. That set the foundation for magical secrecy centuries before the Statute of Secrecy even existed. Without Merlin, the whole wizarding world might look very different today. He let that sit for a moment. So, let's flip the question. What would history look like if Merlin hadn't been around? Silence. A few exchanged looks, clearly trying to figure out if he was really expected them to answer. Percy Weasley sat up a little straighter. Well, if he hadn't pushed for cooperation with Muggles, maybe wizards would have stayed completely separate. Or taken over. Cassian pointed at him. Now we are getting somewhere. Because wizards always had the upper hand, right? More power, longer lifespans, all that. If history had gone another way, we could be the ones ruling them instead of hiding. A few Slytherins looked interested at that. But, Cassian continued, Merlin didn't push for dominance. He believed in balance. He thought wizards should guide, not control. And because of that, Arthur's reign, one where magic and non-magic worked together, became legend. And legends? They stick. With a casual twist of his wrist, the scene morphed. Arthur and Merlin faded, replaced by a battlefield, a clash of two forces, warriors standing on either side. The scene wasn't from any wizarding history he knew, but something borrowed from his past life. A distant figure in grey robes stood at the front, staff raised, holding back the charge of an overwhelming enemy. The faces were too far to make out, but that was the point. It looked grand, mythical, something straight out of a legend. He chuckled, glancing at the class. Of course, no matter the era, people had opinions. And strong opinions tend to lead to conflict. He flicked his wand again, bringing the focus to a lone figure opposite the grey-robed leader. A woman, dark-haired, standing defiantly as flames curled around her hands. Morgana Le Fay, he said. A witch as powerful as Merlin, but standing on the other side of history. And, honestly, can't say I blame her. A few Slytherins straightened in their seats. Some of the Gryffindors looked uneasy. The name Morgana carried weight. Dark witch, enemy of Camelot, all that nonsense. But Cassian wasn't here to spoon-feed them bedtime stories. Now, you lot have heard the usual, Merlin, the noble advisor, champion of Muggle wizard unity. Morgana, the bitter, vengeful sorceress, enemy of progress. But let's think for a moment. He pointed at the illusion. Merlin had power, influence, and, more importantly, the backing of a king. Morgana? She had none of that. And in the Dark Ages, being a woman was already difficult. Being a witch? Downright lethal. He let that sink in. So, tell me, if you lived in an era where Muggles feared magic to the point of burning people alive, how much would you trust them? Silence. A few students exchanged glances. Right. And yet, history paints her as the villain. Cassian grinned. It is easy to call someone evil when you are the one writing the story. Percy Weasley cleared his throat. But she tried to overthrow Camelot. Cassian nodded. She did. And Merlin opposed her. Doesn't mean she was wrong about everything. Magics have a habit of pretending Muggles have always been harmless little lambs. But tell that to the ones who got burned at the stake because someone decided a bad harvest meant witchcraft. Some of the Muggleborns looked a bit pale. Even the purebloods seemed more interested now. Cassian let the illusion shift again, showing robed figures standing over a fire pit, smoke curling into the night. This wasn't a debate. This was survival. Morgana saw Muggles as dangerous, unpredictable. Merlin saw them as people who could be guided. Neither of them was completely right or wrong. They just had different ways of dealing with a world that didn't understand magic. The images faded, leaving nothing but the flicker of candlelight dancing across the walls. Cassian pushed away from the desk, his gaze sweeping the room. History isn't about good versus evil, he said evenly. It is about people making choices, choices based on the information they had, the fears they felt, the power they craved. Sometimes those choices worked out. Sometimes they didn't. But if you sit in this class thinking every so-called dark wizard was a raving lunatic and every hero was some flawless champion of justice, you will fail. Not my class, don't worry about grades, I couldn't care less about them. You will fail at something far more important, understanding. And if you can't understand the past, you are doomed to repeat it. The room fell into silence. Not bad for a first lesson. Finally, Warrington muttered, so, what, we are supposed to sympathize with dark wizards now? Cassian smiled. No, you are supposed to think. I know, terrifying concept. But hey, if that is too much effort, you can always drool on your desk like in Bin's class. A few snickers. Warrington scowled but said nothing. Cassian clapped his hands. Right. Homework, read up on the Merlin-Morgana conflict, but not just the standard drivel. I want at least one source that presents her side of things. A few students groaned. Percy was already scribbling notes. Cassian grinned. Welcome to history, kids. Try not to sleep through it. As Cassian wrapped up the lesson, he decided to push things a step further. He hadn't come to Hogwarts just to drone on about history, he had a theory to test. If teaching magic really advanced his own skills, then he needed to keep experimenting. And what better way to do that than by slipping in a bit of practical magic under the excuse of historical relevance? Right, before I let you lot go, let's talk about something a little more lively. He tapped his wand against the desk. Fire. That got their attention. Even the ones who had been impatient to leave set straight. Incendio, he said, twirling his wand in the air. Fire-making charm. A spell so old that it predates wand usage. Ever wondered how wizards managed before we had these handy little sticks? Rituals, incantations, runes, the lot. Fire was one of the first things magic was ever used for. Survival, warfare, communication. Even now, it is one of the most basic yet useful spells you will ever learn. He flicked his wand at the empty fireplace at the side of the room. Incendio. Flames exploded in the fireplace with a deep humph, heat rolling through the room. Not the timid little sparks most students summoned, but a roaring yet controlled blaze that lit every corner. A few students flinched, one Gryffindor yelped. Cassian let the fire burn for a few seconds before lowering his wand, and the flames shrank down instantly, flickering lazily in the hearth. After playing around with lumos, he figured out something interesting. When he actually put effort into visualization and intent, even the most basic spells became a lot more effective. Seemed obvious in hindsight, but then again, most wizards didn't bother thinking about magic beyond waving their wand and hoping for the best. He turned back to the class, tapping the edge of the desk. Starting now, at the end of every lesson, we will go over a spell, how it was used, why it was important, and how it shaped wizarding history. He let his gaze sweep over them. Because magic isn't just about throwing spells around. It is about understanding why we have them in the first place. Eyebrows arched around the classroom. He gestured toward the fire. Take this one. Incendio. Simple spell, right? Makes fire. But fire isn't simple. It is survival. It is power. It is the reason witches ended up on stakes and kings ended up in history books. But this spell is so old that it probably predates every known record we have. And if something's been around that long, it means it was needed. He leaned back against the desk. So, as historians, we ask questions. Why did wizards need it? What were their circumstances? Were they lighting campfires? Scaring off predators? Trying to imitate magical creatures? Using it as a weapon? Or did they just need to keep warm on a bloody cold night? Percy Weasley raised a hand. Surely it was first used for survival. Before wands, fire would have been essential. Cassian nodded. Good answer. Fire's always been a symbol of power, control over the elements. But it is also a threat. Ever wonder why wizards and fire have such a complicated relationship? Goblins, witches, pyromancy, it all ties together. He crossed his arms. For example, who here knows why muggles started burning witches? Chapter 10, Kitchen. Who here knows why muggles started burning witches? A few hands shot up. They thought witches were evil, a Slytherin girl said. Fear of magic, Percy added. Cassian gave a half shrug. Yeah, sort of. But here is the fun part, it didn't work. He gestured vaguely. Most witches and wizards caught in those burnings just threw on a flame-freezing charm and sat through it like a minor inconvenience. Some even let it happen on purpose, had a laugh, then dissipated when they got bored. A few students snickered. But here is where it gets interesting, Cassian went on. Fire wasn't just something done to wizards. It was also something wizards used. Pyromancy, fire magic, goes way back. Some of the earliest wizarding battles fought with fire. Goblins? Resistant to most kinds of magical flame. Cassian grinned. Fire in your hand? Power. Fire out of control? Chaos. That is the difference between a wizard and a madman with a matchstick. The reason most of you will only ever use incendio to light a few candles and not, say, burn down an entire village? That is control. Which brings us back to incendio, one of the simplest fire spells, but also one of the most useful. You learn this, and you learn the foundation for every flame-based spell that came after it. He waited for them to ponder his words a bit. Most of the class was paying attention now. Even the ones who'd looked bored earlier were watching the fire like it might do something interesting if they stared hard enough. He laughed. Now, let's talk about how people used incendio in history. He turned, pacing a few steps. Take dueling, for example. Back in the old days, wizard duels weren't about stunning and disarming. They were fights to the death. And you know what is a great way to make sure your opponent stays down? He straightened, crossing his arms as he looked over the class. Not answering his rhetoric. One last thing before you go, he said, tapping the desk with his wand. Extra homework. Not mandatory, since I am not your charms professor, but if you do it, I promise you will see an improvement in your magic. Write 2 feet on fire, what it is, why it matters, how it shaped humanity. A few students groaned. He ignored them. Think about it. When you are at a distance, fire is warmth, comfort. Get too close, and it will burn you to ash. It cooks your food, boils your water. God forbid, what would we do without tea? Some students chuckled. Understand it, Cassian said, tapping the desk one last time. Then you will understand why it is one of the first things wizards ever learned to control. That is all. You are dismissed. Chairs scraped against the stone floor as the students gathered their things, some already chatting about the lesson, others eyeing the extinguished fireplace like it might relight itself. Warrington left first, muttering something under his breath to Marcus Flint. Percy lingered, jotting something down on his parchment before following the rest of the Gryffindors out. Cassian slumped to his chair. The first lesson had gone better than expected. They hadn't tuned him out. More importantly, they listened. Even the ones who thought history was pointless had been paying attention. He grabbed his lesson notes, stuffing them into his bag before heading out. His next class wasn't until after lunch, which gave him a few hours to have a bit of fun. Walking through the corridors, Cassian made his way to the kitchen near the Hufflepuff common room. He stopped in front of the large painting of a fruit bowl, eyeing the plump green pear in the middle. If I recall correctly, I should play with that pear, he muttered, reaching out and giving it a quick tickle. The pear wriggled before letting out a high-pitched giggle, then twisted itself into a doorknob. Cassian grabbed it and pulled, stepping into the warm, bustling kitchen. Inside, house elves flitted about, hands busy with trays of food and bubbling cauldrons. The smell of fresh bread and roasting meat filled the air, thick and rich. Cassian barely had time to take it in before a small figure popped up right in front of him. Professor Rosier. The elf squeaked, bowing so low its nose nearly touched the floor. What is Professor wanting? Boppy can bring anything, yes. Cassian took a step back, eyeing the elf. It was shorter than the others, ears slightly drooping, with a clean white tea towel wrapped around its tiny frame like a uniform. Boppy, is it? Cassian asked. The elf bobbed its head so fast Cassian thought it might snap its own neck. Yes, yes. Boppy is in charge of kitchen when househead Sprout is not looking. Cassian raised an eyebrow. Is she supposed to be looking? Boppy froze, eyes darting left and right before whispering, Boppy does not know. Cassian snorted. Relax, I am not here to snitch. I just need something sweet. Healthy ones though, do you do yogurts? Whatever won't give me diabetes before dinner. Before he even finished, Boppy clapped its hands, and 3 elves bolted off in different directions. Within seconds, a silver platter was shoved into Cassian's hands, piled with tarts, shortbread, and something that looked suspiciously like treacle fudge. He whistled. Efficient. Boppy aims to please. The elf chirped. Cassian grabbed a tart and took a bite. Raspberry. A good one. He chewed for a moment before glancing down at Boppy, who was still watching him like a dog waiting for praise. You lot ever get tired of this? Cassian asked, waving the tart in the air. Boppy blinked. Of what, Professor? This. He gestured at the room, the endless cooking, the endless scurrying. Serving wizards all day, every day. Don't tell me it is your greatest joy in life or some nonsense. That is just sad. Boppy looked like Cassian had just suggested jumping off the astronomy tower for a laugh. The little elf's ears drooped, and its big, watery eyes went even wider. Oh, Professor Cassian! What are we poors to do? Boppy wailed, wringing its tiny hands. We are bound to Hogwarts, yes, bound. We cannot be otherwise. Cassian stopped mid-bite, eyeing the elf. Right. So, you are telling me if I tried to free you, you would just, what? Drop dead on the spot. Boppy let out a high-pitched squeak and shook its head violently. No, no, not drop dead, sir. But elves are not made for not serving. Without Hogwarts, we be, nothing. That sounded like absolute bollocks, but Cassian had never paid enough attention to house elves to argue about it. He chewed his tart, thinking. So, you like working yourself half to death, getting kicked around by snotty kids, and living off scraps. He gestured around the kitchen. This is the dream, is it? Boppy blinked, then nodded so fast its ears flapped. Yes, sir. House elves lives to serve, sir. Without work, we is lost without it. Cassian sighed through his nose. Well, that is depressing. Boppy beamed. Thank you, sir. Cassian rubbed his temple. Not a compliment, Boppy. The elf clearly didn't care. It scurried off, probably to go organize a tray of biscuits with the same enthusiasm some people put into duels. Cassian shook his head, grabbed another tart, and left the kitchen before he accidentally started a revolution. Walking to the library, Cassian barely had time to swallow before a sharp voice cut through the air. No food in the library. Madame Pants stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the tart in his hand like he dragged in a tiger. Cassian chewed slowly, staring back at her. Not out of defiance, he was mid-bite, and he wasn't one to rush a good pastry, also chewing was healthy. The silence stretched, and Pants's eye twitched. Swallow, she snapped. Cassian finally did, licking a stray crumb off his thumb. Would you rather I leave these outside or bring them in with me? He gestured to the plate stacked with sweets, as if this was an actual decision she needed to make. Her nostrils flared. You will leave them outside. Of course, Cassian said, walking past her and setting the plate on a windowsill. He glanced at it. No guarantees they will still be here when I get back. Pants made a noise like she didn't care if a swarm of Cornish pixies flew off with them. Cassian strolled in, hands tucked into his robes, scanning the shelves. The place smelled of old parchment and ink. He headed for the history section, dodging a couple of Ravenclaws hunched over a shared textbook. He plucked a tome from the shelf. Magical Conflicts of the 14th Century, and flipped it open, leafing through the contents. Goblin Revolts, Territorial Disputes, an entire section on how a wizarding duel led to a 2-week reign of fire over Lancashire. Interesting enough, but he wanted something older. He slid the book back and reached for another. Ancient Wizarding Cultures, The Lost Arts, when a voice interrupted. You are actually reading. Cassian sighed, already knowing who it was before he turned. Anything I can do for you, Mr. Rosier? Leander Rosier leaned against the bookshelf, arms crossed, looking far too entertained for Cassian's liking. Just making sure my dear cousin isn't completely lost, Leander said, gold-brown eyes glinting. Cassian Rosier in a library. Merlin, did I die and step into some parallel world? Cassian snorted, slipping the book off the shelf. Scandalous, I know. I can actually read. Leander smirked. That is up for debate. Cassian flipped through the pages lazily. Shouldn't you be off cursing tombs or whatever it is you are pretending to do with your summers? Leander tapped a finger against the nearest book spine. Aspiring curse breaker, Cassian. It is a respectable line of work. Cassian hummed. That what we are calling grave robbing these days? Leander laughed. And teaching is a noble pursuit, is it? Compared to looting, yes, Cassian said, shutting the book with a snap. This family reunion is charming, but I got real work waiting. Leander didn't move. You are actually taking this seriously, aren't you? Cassian gave him a look. What gave it away? Leander tilted his head, studying him like he was something new and mildly interesting. The Cassian I remember barely made it through school. Now you are here, throwing around lectures on history like you actually give a damn. Cassian grinned sardonically. Must be a phase. Leander chuckled. Or maybe you've stumbled onto the one thing in life you don't actively loathe. Cassian didn't respond to that. Instead, he tucked the book under his arm and stepped past Leander. Therapy hour is over, deadline is calling. Leander let him go, but not before calling after him, try not to set the school on fire, yet. No promises, Cassian said over his shoulder, pushing out of the library. Why does everyone say the same thing? Chapter 11, Unerasable History. The following days followed a rhythm. Every class started with Cassian flicking his wand and letting Lumos Spectaculum do the heavy lifting. The walls of his classroom came alive with battles, duels, rebellions, and ancient rituals. Students who came expecting another dull hour of names and dates found themselves watching history move before their eyes. Merlin arguing with Arthur, goblins clashing with wizards, witches standing at the stake with smirks, as they pretended to burn in the flames. Once the students were hooked, he would move on. Each lesson ended with a spell, not just recited, but dissected, stripped to its bones. Cassian made them see it, feel it, build it in their heads before even touching a wand. Magics were casting long before wands became fashionable, and he intended his students to know why. Half the time, Hogwarts taught students to memorize spells like a list of ingredients in a potions book. Cassian wanted them to understand what they were doing. He didn't want parrots mumbling Latin. He wanted them to understand, because magics who understood were magics who survived. And it worked. By the end of the first week, history of magic had stopped being the school's designated nap time. Now, students actually looked forward to it. Even the ones who usually coasted through lectures sat up when the lights dimmed and Cassian let history unfold in glowing illusions. Slytherins, Gryffindors, Ravenclaws, Hufflepuffs, it didn't matter. No one liked missing class when they would be the only one who didn't see Charlemagne duel a rogue alchemist or a medieval wizard set fire to an entire castle with a single curse. Of course, not everyone got to have fun. First years weren't ready to be playing with fire yet, quite literally. Cassian made that clear on their first day. He wasn't their charms professor, nor was he in charge of defense against the dark arts. That responsibility fell to Flitwick and Mulford, who would, in due time, teach them the proper way to handle magic without losing an eyebrow, or worse. Probably worse. He told them as much, leaning against his desk as a few eager Gryffindors bounced in their seats, clearly hoping for something more exciting than history. You lot are stuck with me for storytelling, not spell work, he said, eyeing a particularly restless Fred and George Weasley. I will leave the explosions to Professor Flitwick and the dueling to Professor Mulford. They get paid to make sure you don't accidentally set yourselves on fire or hex your own limbs off. I, on the other hand, don't have the patience to deal with screaming first years running around with burnt fingers. A few groaned in protest, but Cassian didn't budge on it. First years weren't ready for practical spell work beyond the basics. Until then, they would stick to history, though if they behaved, he might throw in a few illusions now and then to keep them entertained. He wasn't heartless. Just realistic. But for the rest, Cassian introduced Incendio, the fire-making charm. 6 classes, 4 houses, hundreds of students, all given a crash course in the spell's history, application, and the reality that magic worked best when you actually understood what you were doing. The result was instant. Incendio. Maximum mastery. And, because things apparently weren't weird enough already, 2 more ancient variations landed in his lap. Cassian sat in his quarters that evening, staring at the updated list floating in his mind. Fire-making spell, Incendio. Ancient variant, Sinis Emissa, instead of creating fire, this spell summons the ash of a past flame. The caster sees what was last burned in that location. Can reveal destroyed books, lost scrolls, or hidden evidence of crimes. Fire-making spell, Incendio. Ancient variant, Pyroclave. Unlike modern fire spells that create fire instantly, Pyroclave is a delayed fire release spell that stores flames inside objects, runes, or written texts, only to be unleashed under specific conditions. Cassian narrowed his eyes at the first one. Sinis Emissa. This wasn't fire. It forced fire to give up its secrets. The ashes of whatever was burned would retain the memory of what they once were, revealing hidden truths long thought lost. That kind of magic wasn't just old, it was dangerous. His vision blurred as something pulled his mind, dragging him somewhere else. He let it take him. A dark alley. Wet stone glistening under the dim glow of a wand. A hooded figure moving quickly, stacks of books piled in a ditch. He flipped through pages in frantic desperation before tossing them into a conjured fire. Flames swallowed parchment, curling ink into smoke. Whatever was written there, gone. Days later, a different person stood by the same ditch. Hood drawn, wand raised. Sinis Emissa. The ashes, long settled into filth and rainwater, glowed red. Slowly, they lifted, falling into place, not whole, no. Not even close, but enough. Pages, as incomplete as they may, hovered in the air. Letters formed meaning. The wizard's breath hitched. A name. A date. A crime long buried was now revealed. The wizard staggered back. Sinis Emissa didn't just summon fire, it rewound destruction caused by it, let the past bleed back into the present. A wizard could stand in a burned-down library and see every page that had turned to cinders, hear voices that had long since gone silent. Or, in the wrong hands, erase the evidence entirely. The vision snapped out like a flame smothered by wind. Cassian inhaled sharply, fingers tightening around his wand. Of course it had been banned. Magic like this didn't preserve history, it weaponized it. If criminals used fire to erase evidence, it meant entire histories could be rewritten. But those who knew the spell could unwrite the rewriting. His gaze flicked back to the list. Pyroclave. Again, his vision shifted. A master runesmith in a dimly lit workshop, his hands quick as he carved words into stone. Each letter glowed as he whispered the spell. Pyroclave. The light faded, the inscription vanishing before his eyes. To anyone else, the stone was blank. But the fire was there, waiting. Centuries passed. A thief, careless and greedy, stumbled into the abandoned ruins. His fingers traced over the old stone, rubbing at the surface as if searching for treasure. The moment his palm rested fully against the inscription, it ignited. Fire roared to life from the once invisible words, consuming him in a flash of heat and screaming embers. Later, the runesmith's apprentices stood before the charred remains of their master's workshop. The knowledge was too dangerous, they agreed. It had to be destroyed. One by one, they set fire to the scrolls detailing Pyroclave, swearing the spell would die with them. Magic designed to last. Magic that carried intent across generations. Cassian rested his head against the back of his chair, staring at the ceiling. What was he supposed to do with this? These weren't just lost spells. They were remnants of something older than Hogwarts itself, magic that had shaped history before history was recorded. And now, for whatever reason, they were resurfacing. His grip on his wand loosened. Interesting. Cassian stepped into the headmaster's office, greeted by the sight of 4 house heads already seated. Dumbledore sat at his desk, fingers steepled, while McGonagall, Sprout, Flitwick, and Snape occupied their usual spots. Professor Rosier, Dumbledore greeted with a soft smile. I trust your first few weeks have been enlightening. Cassian folded his arms. That is one way to put it. McGonagall adjusted her spectacles. I believe revolutionary would be more accurate. I've had no fewer than 20 students tell me that history of magic is now their favorite subject. Flitwick beamed. Quite right. I've seen students practicing spells from your lessons in the corridors, been years since I've seen such a genuine enthusiasm. Snape snorted sharply through his nose. Yes, quite the marvel. Teaching history through elaborate illusions and, correct me if I am mistaken, practical spell work. He didn't mask his disapproval, nor his constant disdain for Cassian. So the board hired you to teach spells now, did they? Shall we all start treading on each other's subjects? Cassian enjoyed his expression for a few seconds, just staring, before saying, God forbid we make history interesting. Next thing you know, students might start thinking for themselves. McGonagall cut in before Snape could fire back. The issue, Professor Rosier, is that your methods, while undeniably effective, blur the lines between subjects. First years expect spell work in their history classes, and while I appreciate your enthusiasm, it does complicate matters. Cassian smiled lightly. He long knew his methods would raise some questions. I assure you all, my intention is to teach and nothing more. I know my appointment here isn't exactly based on merit, and I understand the concerns that might raise. But I take my responsibilities seriously. McGonagall studied him over the rim of her glasses. That much is clear. Sprout nodded. More than clear. You've managed to make a subject students usually sleep through into something they actually talk about outside of class. I hear about your lessons in my greenhouses more than I do about actual herbology. Snape's mouth twisted, displeasure obvious. Yes, truly groundbreaking. I imagine Flitwick and Mulford are thrilled to have a history professor who fancies himself a charms and defense instructor as well. Cassian didn't bother looking at him. I don't teach them anything they haven't already covered in their charms or defense classes. I only step in once the spell is familiar, to show them where it came from, how it has changed over time, and why it mattered. I am not getting ahead of anyone, I am filling in what gets left out. Snape's lip curled slightly, but Dumbledore cut in before he could say more. Professor Rosier, would you mind giving us a demonstration? I admit, I am rather curious myself. Cassian leaned back in his chair. Any requests? Dumbledore's smile deepened. Surprise us, Professor Rosier. That does seem to be your speciality. Chapter 12, Softening Charm. Cassian pulled out his wand and flicked it. The air shimmered as a golden haze spread across the room, swallowing the office whole. The walls of stone vanished, replaced by a vast battlefield under a storm-dark sky. Wizards in ancient robes clashed with glowing blades of raw magic. Smoke curled from the ground where curses had struck, and above it all, a woman stood. Morgana stood tall, her cloak pooling behind her like spilled ink in the mist. She raised her hands, and the storm above obeyed. Lightning cracked, splitting the battlefield apart, and with a single command, her forces surged forward, cutting through the enemy ranks like fire through parchment. It was war, but not the version in children's tales. This was blood, chaos, and magic wielded for ruthless ambitions. Cassian let it linger for a moment before flicking his wand again. The vision faded. The room settled back into itself, though the silence stretched. McGonagall's lips pressed thin, hands clasped tighter than necessary in her lap. Flitwick looked impressed. Sprout thoughtful. Typical, Snape murmured, his voice dripping with disdain. A Rosier glamorizing a witch who despised muggles. How refreshing. Dumbledore tilted his head. You seem to have cast Morgana in quite a favorable light, from what I hear. Cassian shrugged. She was one of the most powerful witches of her time. That doesn't change just because she wasn't on the right side of history. Snape's lip curled. Except she was the spearhead of the anti-Muggle movement. Cassian turned his gaze on him. History's never been black and white, Severus. Only fools and propagandists believe otherwise. You can despise someone's ideology and still acknowledge their skill. Or would you prefer I sanitize it and pretend she was just a cackling villain throwing curses in the dark? Dumbledore interjected before Snape could respond. An interesting perspective, Professor Rosier. One that I imagine has certainly given your students much to think about. Cassian nodded. I know where your distrust comes from, and I agree that as teachers, we shape how students see the world. That is why I never liked how Binns taught. He was biased against anything non-human, made sure students saw goblins, centaurs, and merfolk as footnotes in wizard history rather than actual players. He leaned back. I don't praise Morgana, and I don't embellish her fear and hatred of muggles. I show what shaped her. In her time, being a woman was already difficult, being a witch was worse. Wizards were kings, heroes, scholars. Witches were shadows, healers, whispers in the dark. If they stepped out of line, they weren't just punished, they were erased. A perspective I imagine not all parents would appreciate, McGonagall said coolly, though a glint in her eyes betrayed her approval. Flitwick gave a small nod. I dare say students are learning more than just dates and names in your class, Professor Rosier. Apparently too much, Snape muttered. Cassian didn't bother responding. He wasn't about to waste time debating Snape's fondness for rigid, mindless teaching. Instead, he turned to Dumbledore. As a historian and the history of magic professor at one of the best wizarding schools in Europe, I would say it is my job to provide context, how spells came to be, how different magical communities thought, and how these spells were used, he said. And, as I repeatedly remind my students, none of this is mandatory. Those who want to further their magical masteries can complete additional assignments at their own discretion. McGonagall gave him a long look, then nodded. As long as it is clear where the boundaries lie. Cassian spread his hands. Crystal. Dumbledore nodded. I believe, as you put it, this is still within the scope of your title. And as long as your methods aren't dangerous, we have no reason to limit how you teach. From what I've seen, you've done a rather good job. Cassian smiled wryly. Glad we are in agreement. They went over a few more things. Cassian pointed out something he had already covered in his summer festival lecture. Magic wasn't just about flicking a wand the right way and rattling off a bit of Latin. The more clearly a wizard understood and visualized their magic, the more they could shape it. He had demonstrated that with lumos, showing how intent alone could alter its brightness, color, or even direction. In his first few weeks, he had taken the same approach with incendio. And everyone in the room had to admit, grudgingly, in some cases, that they had seen a sharp increase in students' mastery over the spell. McGonagall tapped her fingers on the desk. I had 4th years in Transfiguration applying your method to their own spell work. It seems your lessons have encouraged them to think beyond rote memorization. Flitwick nodded. A rather commendable result. If students truly understand the magic they wield, they are less likely to misuse it. Snape, predictably, looked unimpressed. Or perhaps you are encouraging a generation of children to play with fire, and we will be the ones cleaning up the ashes. Cassian leaned back. If they understand what they are doing, they won't have to rely on waving their wands around hoping for the best. I would argue that is safer than the alternative. Better they burn their fingers in here than set the world alight because no one taught them properly. Snape gave him a look but didn't argue. The discussion moved on to other matters, disciplinary concerns, upcoming events, and the usual bureaucratic nonsense Cassian had little interest in. When it was finally over, he left the office without bothering to glance at Snape, who looked as though he had just swallowed a lemon. The next day, Cassian's class was with the 5th-year Slytherins and Ravenclaws. At the front of the room, his cousin, Selina Rosier, sat with the same innate grace she always carried. Unlike most of their family, Selina wasn't an idiot. She actually had a brain and used it. Their relationship had never been particularly close, but she didn't look at him like he was a complete waste of air, which, considering the Rosier name, was saying something. Cassian waved his wand, and a globe hovered in the air, its surface shifting until it showed a single, unfamiliar continent. Cassian leaned back against his desk, arms crossed. How many of you know how the world was created? He asked. Silence. A few glances were exchanged. Some students looked suspicious. A Ravenclaw, Lenny Pindlebrook, spoke first. Mythologically or magically? Either. Both. With a twist of his wrist, the globe reformed, the continents shearing apart into new shapes. Every culture has its stories, gods sculpting mountains from chaos, cosmic eggs cracking open, titans bleeding oceans into existence. Wizards are no different, we just like to pretend our versions are smarter. He gestured, and the image morphed, displaying crude cave drawings, early depictions of magic. And then there is magic itself. No one really knows where it started. Some believe it's always been here, woven into the fabric of the world. Others think it came later, a gift, or a curse, bestowed by something greater. A Muggle-born girl hesitated before raising her hand. Muggles believe Earth used to be part of the Sunday. Cassian glanced at her. Go on. She shifted in her seat. Well, the solar system formed from this massive cloud of gas and dust. Gravity pulled everything together, and the sun ignited first. The planets, including Earth, came from the leftover material. Over millions of years, Earth cooled down, oceans formed, life began, then evolution took over. Cassian nodded. Not far off from some wizarding theories. The magical community doesn't dispute the physical formation of the planet, rocks are rocks whether you use a wand or not. But where we differ is what happened after. He flicked his wand, and the floating globe shifted, its continents rearranging. Most wizards believe that magic was always here, woven into the planet itself in the form of ley lines, natural channels of magical energy. The globe changed again, showing a supercontinent. This is Pangaea. Millions of years ago, all land on Earth was one massive piece. It eventually broke apart, forming the continents we know today. Early magical beings existed long before humans, shaping the land with abilities that modern wizards can only theorize about. The illusion dissolved, and Cassian started to walk between the rows. Evolution was also part of it. The first magical humans didn't just appear out of nowhere. There is evidence that ancient magical communities developed separately from Muggle ones, different lineages, different adaptations. A Slytherin boy frowned. Then why are there Muggle-borns? Cassian shrugged. No one knows for certain. Magic doesn't follow strict hereditary rules. Some believe it skips generations. Others think it is an ancient bloodline trait that reawakens. Then there is the theory that magic itself chooses people. Either way, magic doesn't care about bloodlines, no matter how loudly purebloods wish it did. Bloodlines might tilt the odds, sure, but they don't decide the outcome. That's the part they never admit. He let that settle before continuing. Now, history. Who can tell me the earliest recorded magical civilization? Selena Rosier raised her hand. The Sumerians. Cassian nodded. Correct. The Sumerians were among the first to document magic in writing. Their clay tablets detail rituals, spells, and magical laws, some of which evolved into modern incantations. He gestured, and glowing symbols floated in the air. These are proto-runes, early attempts at codifying magic. Before wands, before structured spell work, witches and wizards relied on runes, spoken incantations, and raw willpower. Lenny lifted a hand again, brow furrowed. What about Egyptian magic? He tapped the air, runes melted into elegant hieroglyphs. Ancient Egypt took magical practice to another level. Their spells were so tightly woven into daily life that it was impossible to separate magic from religion, governance, or even medicine. Wards, protective enchantments, preservation magic, they pioneered it. A Slytherin girl muttered, and grave curses. Cassian smirked. Oh, plenty of those. Egyptian curse magic was exceptionally advanced, layered with intent-based spells that didn't just activate when disturbed, but actively sought out trespassers. That is why tomb raiding is such a spectacularly bad idea, though some still insist on testing their luck. A few chuckles. Leander Rosier's aspiring curse-breaker ambitions were well known in the castle. To hear his cousin say this, well, gossip was bound to spread. Cassian let the discussion continue, nudging students to consider how early magical societies influenced modern spell casting. Eventually, he brought them back to the present topic. Now, on to something practical. He tapped the board, and the word softening charm, spungify, appeared. This spell was historically used for cushioning falls, making terrain easier to traverse, and even altering the consistency of objects for various purposes. A Ravenclaw scoffed. Sounds useless. Cassian raised a brow. Does it? The Ravenclaw, clearly unimpressed, shrugged. I mean, bouncing off the ground doesn't seem that useful compared to, I don't know, actual spells that do something. Try falling 50 feet off a broom, then tell me spungify's useless, Selena drawled without looking up. Cassian grinned. Exactly. Funny how the simplest spells suddenly matter when you are plummeting face first into the ground. He tapped his wand against the board, and the words shifted, highlighting different uses throughout history. Cassian looked at the class. The first recorded use of this spell dates back to the Sumerians. They are believed to have used it in construction and spell carving. Chapter 13, Selena Rosier. Cassian pulled a rough chunk of stone from his desk, placing it in front of him. Then, from his robes, he pulled a small knife. Without warning, he stabbed the blade into the rock. A sharp crack echoed through the room as dust scattered from the impact. Stone is rigid. Push hard enough, and it shatters. That is true of rocks, bones, even kingdoms, he said, dusting off the handle and set it down, instead pulling his wand. Now, watch. He muttered, spungify. A faint shimmer passed over the stone's surface. Cassian grabbed the knife again and slammed it down hard with the flat side. Instead of cracking, the stone compressed slightly, absorbing the impact like thick rubber. The blade bounced off harmlessly. A few students leaned forward, intrigued. Others glanced at each other, eyebrows raised. Professor, could you really use it to jump off a tower without splattering? A Slytherin asked, half joking. Cassian tilted his head. If your goal is to bounce like a deranged quaffle, sure. But you would better hope your aim is flawless. Miss the spell by a hair and all they will find is a very squishy crater that needs cleaning. A few students laughed nervously. Anyone else want to suggest launching yourselves off towers? Or shall we try for a question that won't make me lose faith in magic's kind? A Ravenclaw raised her hand timidly. Could it be used on armor to soften incoming blows? Now that is a proper question, Cassian said, nodding. It was used as such, especially before shield charms became widespread. Though if you are softening armor, make sure you undo it before someone stabs you. You won't like how it feels when a blade sinks through like butter. In medieval times, softening charms were common in dueling. Instead of dodging spells, some wizards softened even their own skin to absorb impacts without injury. Healers used them for setting bones, less risk of fractures snapping completely. And, of course, thieves loved them. Made locks easier to break, floors quieter to walk on, and walls less of a barrier if you knew where to cast. Though, keep in mind, it is effective against blunt objects, but not so much against sharp ones. After making sure there weren't more ludicrous questions, he continued. Softening charms aren't just for making the floor more comfortable when you fall on your arse off your broom, Cassian said. They were used in ancient construction to shape stone before wizards had precise transfiguration. They made carving easier, moving materials simpler, and even dampened vibrations to prevent buildings from collapsing during earthquakes. He gestured to the board, where the words shifted. Applications through history. A student tilted her head. And in modern use. Cassian thought of explaining how the same spell could be used in many ways in the modern age as well, but felt it would cause more confusion. Instead, he said, magic shifts with time. What started as a battlefield spell ends up a convenience charm. Give it a century, and someone will use it to make sofa cushions fluffier. What was practical 1,000 years ago might seem pointless now, until you need it. He flicked his wand, and the illusions vanished, along with the floating words. Optional homework, non-mandatory, you can write a 2-foot essay on practical uses of the softening charm outside of duels. Think beyond the obvious. What does softening actually mean? What happens when a rigid structure loses its hardness? Apply it to anything, materials, magic, even history. Stretch your brains, if you remember how. And no. Don't cast Spungify on your brains to stretch it. As always, these are optional. I am not your charms professor. A few students scribbled notes. Others exchanged glances, weighing whether the effort was worth it. Cassian had already figured out who would bother with the assignment and who would pretend it didn't exist. That is all for today. Unless you want to spend the rest of class staring at me, you are free to go. Chairs scraped against the floor as students packed up. Some left immediately, others lingered, discussing the lesson. Selena Rosier tapped her quill against the desk, watching him like he was some particularly strange puzzle she was trying to figure out. After a moment, she smiled softly, glad you found your passion, cousin. Cassian chuckled, tucking his wand back into his sleeve. Took a while, but I suppose it is in the blood. He gestured toward her notes. How is spell creation treating you? Selena leaned back, crossing her arms loosely. Better than expected. Master Goshawk actually acknowledged my last submission. Said it had potential. Cassian furrowed his brows. That was no small feat. Miranda Goshawk wasn't just any spell theorist, she was the spell theorist. If she thought something had potential, it meant something. Impressive. What does it do? Selena looked away, probably considering if it was safe to say. She must have decided it was, as she said, it is a stabilization charm. Works on unstable enchantments, wards, runes, experimental spells that are on the verge of collapse. Cassian frowned slightly. Wouldn't that make it ridiculously easy to reverse engineer other people's work? Her lips curved. Exactly. He huffed a laugh. Dangerous. She shrugged. So is half the magic we use daily. He couldn't argue with that. Magic had never been safe, it just depended on who was wielding it. When do you start the apprenticeship? Next summer. It is not official yet, but Master Goshawk hinted she would take me on if I keep up my work. Cassian nodded. That was very official in Miranda Goshawk terms. Guess we will have to toast to your inevitable world domination then. Selena grinned. Naturally. She glanced around, checking the empty classroom before leaning in slightly. Was it all an act? Before. When you were. Cassian snorted a laugh. Almost a squib. Selina sighed, unimpressed. That. And the rest, kicking elves, torturing servants, acting like you owned the world. Cassian sighed through his nose, running a hand over the worn cover of the book on his desk. How was he supposed to explain that the old Cassian was gone? That a different soul had taken his place? It wasn't something he could say, not that he would even if he could. The Rosiers weren't known for being forgiving, and obliterating someone's soul out of sheer offense felt entirely within their capabilities. Instead, Cassian watched Selina with something between amusement and curiosity. You tell me, Selina. You were always smarter than the rest of them. Are you not supporting our dear family's cause? Blood purity, Dark Lord, hating muggles, and halves. Selina drummed her fingers on the desktop, faked a shudder. You sound like Aunt Viola. Tragic, Cassian muttered, feigning a shudder. I would hate to be mistaken for her. Selina smiled but didn't rise to the bait. I've never been one for blind tradition. Just because our ancestors worshipped idiocy doesn't mean we have to light the same candles. That is practically heresy, Cassian said, deadpan. Great-great-great-great-grandmother Serphia is going to crawl out of her grave and hex you for that one. Selina rolled her eyes. Oh, please. Grandma Serphia would have burned half the family for being incompetent bootlickers. She rested her chin on her hand, gaze locked on him. You didn't answer my question, though. Were you faking? Before. Cassian shrugged. Would it make a difference? She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words against what she remembered. Not really, she admitted. But it is strange. You used to be, I don't know. An arse. I was going to say a spoiled, arrogant waste of potential, Selina said, smiling mischievously, but yes, that too. Flattering, Cassian said. And now? Selina considered. Still an arse, but significantly less of a git. Though I suppose teaching history isn't the worst thing you could be doing. Cassian scoffed. High praise from a Rosier. I like to think I have some taste, she said, then adding softer. You are actually good at this. Teaching, I mean. Cassian exhaled, glancing at the now empty classroom. Turns out I enjoy it. Selina gave him a look, half incredulous. That might be the most shocking thing I heard all year. Glad to keep you entertained. Cassian glanced at her notes. To answer your question, it wasn't an act but self-preservation. You are smart enough to figure out the rest. Selina didn't react right away. Her gaze flicking from Cassian to the board, then back to him. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't disbelief either. Disappointed. She chuckled. No, just intrigued. By what? Selina tapped the end of her quill against her chin. You've changed, cousin. It is not just the teaching. It is like you woke up one day and decided to be someone else. Cassian chuckled. Must have hit my head. Hard enough to knock sense into you? Miraculous. He chuckled, but the curiosity in her eyes didn't fade. After a moment, she glanced at the clock and sighed. I have runes next. Try not to make too many enemies before lunch. No promises. And say hi to Professor Babbling. Selina shook her head and packed up her things. As she left, Cassian turned back to his desk, gathering his own notes. Chapter 14, Aromic Bomb. Walking through the halls of Hogwarts, Cassian spotted a familiar figure ahead. Professor Quirinus Quirrell, the Muggle Studies professor, was heading in the same direction, a stack of books levitating beside him. Cassian was planning to pick Quirrell's brain for some time. Curious about how Muggle society functioned in this world, he decided to strike up a conversation. If things ran parallel to his old world, he had some investments to make. Bitcoin, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon. Magical history was fascinating, but knowing how the Muggle world operated could be just as useful. He picked up his pace. Professor Quirrell, he called, catching up. Got time for a chat? Quirrell glanced over, adjusting his grip on the book at the top of his floating pile. Professor Rosier, he said, surprised. A chat. Cassian nodded to the nearest staircase. Tea, maybe? I have questions about your subject. Quirrell hesitated, then nodded. I suppose I can spare some time. They made their way to the staff room. It was practically empty at this hour. A house elf had already set out a tea tray, Hogwarts enchantments running like clockwork to cater to its inhabitants, all the time. Cassian poured them both tea while Quirrell arranged his books into a neat stack, watching him curiously. "I was hoping to ask a few questions about Muggle society," Cassian said, adding a splash of milk to his tea. "I have a general idea of where they stand, but I want to get a clearer picture of the recent situations." Quirrell raised an eyebrow. "Well, are you really interested in Muggle world? No offense, but your family." Cassian shook his head with a smile. "Unlike most Rosiers, I don't burst into flames if I hear the word electricity." Quirrell huffed a laugh. "Fair point." He stirred his tea. "Well, it depends on what you want to know. Technology, politics, social structure. Muggle society evolves much faster than the wizarding world. What was cutting edge a decade ago is practically ancient now." That was exactly the kind of confirmation Cassian needed. If things were developing along the same lines as his past life. "Let's start broad," Cassian said. "Technology, for instance. Electricity, transportation, entertainment, how far have they come?" Quirrell sipped his tea. "Electricity is everywhere. It powers homes, cities, even vehicles. Muggles have machines that can process information faster than any wizard, and they communicate instantly across vast distances. Moving pictures, films, have sound now, and color. There are devices in homes that play music on command, no magic needed." Cassian feigned amazement. "Fascinating. And what are these marvelous trinkets called?" "The ones that can process information." Quirrell set his teacup down. "Computers." Cassian hummed. "Very modern. Who is responsible for these mechanical brain boxes, then?" Quirrell frowned slightly, thinking. The concept has been around for decades, but Muggle development accelerated during the war. World War II, that is. Initially, they were massive, room-sized machines used for calculations. Now, companies like IBM are bringing them into homes and businesses. Cassian barely stopped himself from smirking. Exactly what he wanted to hear. "And what do these computers actually do? Aside from, I assume, making Muggles feel clever." Quirrell burst into a laughter. "A great deal, actually. They store and process information, solve complex equations, and even assist in communication. Businesses use them for record keeping, banks rely on them, and researchers input vast amounts of data for analysis." He took another sip of tea. "Muggles are entirely dependent on them now. Some even predict that within a few decades, nearly every home in the developed world will have one." Cassian tapped his fingers against his cup, as if in deep thought. "And these companies? IBM, you said? Are they the only ones? Or just the biggest players?" Quirrell shrugged. "There are others, of course, but three dominate the market. IBM was around the longest. Apple and Microsoft are newer, but they've been making rapid advancements. Apple is known for making computers user-friendly, while Microsoft focuses on software, programs that run on computers, like a set of magical instructions." Cassian nodded as if he were only mildly interested, though in reality, his mind was already running through possibilities. If the timeline was the same, Apple had just released the Macintosh, and Microsoft was expanding its dominance with Windows. And IBM, well, they were still the giants. "And where does the world stand?" Cassian asked, keeping his tone casual. "Politically, economically. Are Muggles still trying to kill each other every few years?" Quirrell gave him a bemused look. "You make it sound as though wizards don't have their own share of conflicts." Cassian smirked. "Touché." Quirrell exhaled, considering. The Cold War is still ongoing, though tensions have eased since Gorbachev took power in the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall still stands, but some think it won't for much longer. America remains dominant in many ways, especially in technology and finance, but Japan has been rising economically. The UK, well. He gestured vaguely. Not quite the empire it once was. Cassian snorted. "You don't say." Quirrell continued. "The European Economic Community, precursor to what some predict will become a unified European market, is growing stronger. The Middle East remains a hotspot for conflict, particularly with the situation in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, China is opening up its economy, which could shift global power in the coming decades." Cassian sipped his tea, taking it all in. It was almost exactly as he remembered from his past life. That meant he had time to invest, time to plan. Quirrell gave him a smile. It is refreshing to be able to speak so freely with another wizard at Hogwarts. Cassian gave a lazy shrug. Understanding the bigger picture. History, as you know, isn't just about the past, it is about patterns. How power shifts, how innovations shape societies. He chuckled. And, let's be honest, half the wizarding world wouldn't last a week if the statute of secrecy ever broke. Seems sensible to understand the Muggle arsenal. Can't fight what you don't bother to learn about. Quirrell tilted his head. You think Muggle technology could pose a threat? Cassian leaned in slightly, as if about to share the world's greatest secret. A student of mine mentioned something. Muggles have this thing called an aromic bomb. Apparently, it can flatten entire cities. That true? Quirrell blinked. You mean an atomic bomb? Cassian snapped his fingers. That is the one. Quirrell set his cup down carefully, watching Cassian with mild amusement. Yes, it is real. Muggles developed it during the last Great War. World War II. It is a weapon that harnesses nuclear fission to create an explosion of unprecedented scale. The Americans used 2 of them in 1945, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation was... He hesitated, searching for the right word. Absolute. Cassian raised an eyebrow. So, what? One spell, but for Muggles. Quirrell's lips twitched. Not quite. Magic doesn't have an equivalent. We can conjure fire, destroy objects, even collapse buildings, but nothing in the wizarding world matches the sheer scale of an atomic bomb. It is not just fire and force, it is radiation, lasting consequences, an entire region left uninhabitable for years. Cassian tested. And Muggles just have these lying around. Quirrell folded his hands. Several countries have them. America, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, China. They call it a deterrent, the idea being that if everyone has the power to wipe each other out, no one will risk using it. Cassian let out a low whistle. Bloody hell! That is why I am interested. That is terrifying. Quirrell nodded, checking around as if anyone was listening. It is. A single bomb can level an entire city, kill hundreds of thousands in seconds, and poison the land for generations. Muggles don't need magic to be dangerous, Professor Rosier. Cassian swirled his tea, and yet wizards strut about like lords of the universe. Arrogance really is our favorite spell. Quirrell gave a knowing smile. True. Arrogance is a powerful thing. Cassian raised an eyebrow. How many of these things do they have? The exact number isn't known, but the major powers have thousands between them. More than enough to wipe out civilization several times over. Cassian let that sink in. Wizards spent centuries believing they were untouchable, hiding behind the statute of secrecy, convinced Muggles were weak, insignificant. And yet, here they were, sitting on a stockpile of weapons that could do more damage in a minute than the darkest magic ever could. But the opposite was also true. Wizards had a significant advantage: information. If the world didn't know about magic, then magical society was already a step ahead. An atomic bomb was dangerous, sure. But if magical communities worked together, they could easily ward against such weapons while using their own magic to destroy Muggle strongholds. Simple. If Muggles could burn entire cities with one atomic bomb, what would happen if a wizard layered wards on top of such technology? Could magic and science mesh, or would they rip each other apart? Cassian had no doubt that political leaders were aware of magic and magical communities to some extent. Whether they had their own wizards in place to counter magical interference was another question. Logic suggested they did. Governments weren't stupid, and if they knew magic existed, they would want a way to control or, at the very least, counteract it. The real question was how deep that connection ran. One day you will publish a handbook on Muggle mayhem, I am sure. Cassian laughed. Wouldn't be much of a historian if I didn't leave a mark. Quirrell hummed, setting his cup down. I suppose not. Chapter 15, Bath's Hada babbling. Hi. First of all, no, I am not deleting comments. Web novel is acting up again, comments are appearing late or not showing at all. Either they were banished to someone's black hole or they will eventually appear. Secondly, I truly appreciate all the feedback. Here are some of my thoughts and reasoning. I included the old Cassian in the first and second chapters because his past will come up later. If I didn't show his character and demeanor, it would feel baseless when certain characters, who may appear in the future, show strong hatred toward Cassian. This has come up a lot. Dumbledore didn't learn something new from Cassian. He was being humble. As for intent, visualization, and focus, these are common knowledge to us, but the books barely mention them. Many of you are mixing your fandoms with canon. What you know comes from very few hints, really, too few. Patronus charm. Nonverbal spells. Bellatrix mocking Harry for not meaning to hurt. Aside from these, there's no real mention of intent in spell casting. Why does Cassian ask Quirrell about the Muggle world? 4 weeks before he came to Hogwarts, he was cramming magical history to avoid babbling like a fool in front of students. He couldn't just wander into the Muggle world, not that he even knew how to get there, and stop someone to ask, "Hi, how is the world? Who runs it? What tech companies are out there?" So he acted curious and tried to learn from Quirrell instead. Does Quirrell know a lot about Muggles for a wizard? That is debatable. But as the professor of Muggle studies, it is expected that he at least knows about the latest developments. Maybe I gave him more knowledge than is realistic, fair, but every year, Muggle-born students enter Hogwarts, and someone in his position should have that baseline understanding. Why doesn't Cassian know Dumbledore, but he knows Voldemort and Grindelwald? Again, you are using meta-knowledge to judge the FIC. Students in universe don't know how mighty Dumbledore really is. Twins even call him a senile old man. Yes, he bested Grindelwald decades ago, but decades passed since then. To most people, he is not some godlike figure, he is just the eccentric headmaster of a school. I think my phrasing in that chapter was clear. Cassian wasn't surprised that Dumbledore learned something. Cassian reasoned that a man who had risen to such a position would never stop learning. That is why I wrote, the man was learning for years. What surprised Cassian was that Dumbledore accepted it so openly. It shows Cassian does have an idea about Dumbledore, but he isn't seeing him through our meta-knowledge lens. Most important fact you should know, Cassian's knowledge of the magical world comes from old Cassian. You know, the same arrogant, useless, tyrannical waste of air you all read about. The original Cassian couldn't even cast magic properly, and you expect him to know all the deep secrets of the magical world? That is hilarious. Some of you are projecting meta-knowledge, things you know as readers, onto him. He is not operating with your omniscient perspective, he is piecing things together with scraps from a man who spent his life failing. Don't get me wrong, I love constructive feedback. It helps me improve and think from new angles. But some of the comments and reviews lately aren't feedback, they are outright insults aimed at me. Let me make this clear, my intelligence is not open to debate by strangers on the internet. You are welcome to criticize my writing, my plot, my characters, all of that is fair game. But keep me out of your evaluations. Thank you. Sincerely. Here, have a bonus chapter. Days passed in much the same way. Classes, paperwork, the occasional meeting where Snape glared at him like he was some particularly stubborn bit of dirt that wouldn't scrub off. Cassian kept his lessons lively with illusions and demonstrations, and somehow, Hogwarts' finest didn't turn history of magic into their nap time. Before long, the first term was over. The school emptied for the holidays, leaving behind only a handful of students and staff. Cassian stayed, partly because he had work to do, partly because he had no interest in a Rosier family Christmas. The second term arrived with the usual chaos, students grumbling about returning to routine, professors already preparing for exams, and Cassian, as always, rolling out fresh illusions so even the drowsiest Gryffindors stayed upright. One evening, after a long day of grading essays that ranged from passable to "did this person even read the assignment?", Cassian ended up in the staff lounge, nursing a headache and pretending the crackling fire was soothing rather than irritating, with Bath's Haida babbling sat near, a book balanced on one knee. Cassian had barely spoken to her when they were both students. She was a few years ahead, known for being the kind of student who actually enjoyed runes, which had made her an alien species in his book back then. Oh, in a different house. Now, though, they shared the same workplace, and over the past few months, they somehow fallen into the habit of sitting together in moments like this, silent, companionable, each lost in their own reading or paperwork. He dropped into the armchair opposite her with a sigh, setting down his stack of essays. Bath's Haida glanced up. That bad? Cassian picked up the top essay, skimmed the opening paragraph, then flipped it over and let it drop onto the table, so she could see for herself. Some of them make me question if literacy is actually a requirement for Hogwarts admission. She chuckled. If they struggle with English, I dread to think how they will manage ancient runes. Cassian smirked, flipping through another essay. You might be underestimating their creativity. I had one student cite a reliable source for an assignment. When I asked what source, she said my uncle. Bathsheba snorted, shutting her book. And I told her that unless her uncle was Merlin in disguise, that answer wasn't going to cut it. He tossed the essay onto the growing pile of disappointment. Judging by her glare, I am now on her family's people to hex on site list. Clearly a flaw in your teaching, she said with a smile. Obviously. Next time, I will accept my mum said so as solid historical evidence. She shook her head, amused, and took a sip of her tea. The fire crackled, filling the comfortable silence between them. The staff lounge was mostly empty. Sinistra was hunched over her papers like the constellations themselves had betrayed her, Quill scratching furiously, and Vector had stormed out earlier, muttering about bloody numbers rebelling again like arithmancy was a sentient enemy. Cassian filled his cup, taking a sip. How is your lot handling their work? Bathsheba hummed, considering. Not terribly, though translating runes still gives some of them a headache. Half the class thinks they can just memorize them like spell incantations. They think they can brute force a language. They are trying, she said, setting down her cup. One poor Ravenclaw attempted to wing it on a translation exam. He guessed half the meanings and confidently informed me that an ancient Norse inscription meant "May your fields be fertile and your goats obedient." Cassian barked a laugh. Please tell me that wasn't an actual rune. Sadly, no. The real translation was closer to honor the ancestors, lest they forsake you. But I appreciate the creativity. Points for effort. I gave him points for making me laugh. She added with a laugh. The door swung open, and Quirrell stepped in, looking mildly surprised to see them. Oh, good evening. Cassian nodded in greeting. Quirrell. Bathsheba glanced up. Quirinus. Quirrell hesitated, then grabbed himself a cup of tea before sitting down across from them. I assume the students are being particularly disastrous if you are both here complaining about them. Not complaining, Cassian said, nudging his stack of essays. Merely appreciating the depths of their academic struggles. Quirrell huffed a laugh, stirring his tea. Muggle studies isn't much different. I had one student argue that electricity must be some kind of controlled lightning magic. Another tried to claim Muggles use tiny house elves to make machines work. Cassian raised a brow. And you didn't let them run with that. Bathsheba smiled. Now that would make for an interesting essay. Oh, some of their theories are creative, Quirrell said. One of them is convinced that televisions are a form of divination. Moving pictures that talk? Obviously, Muggles are peering into the future. Cassian snorted. Right. And telephones are just enchanted mirrors, but worse. Quirrell sipped his tea. I do wonder, though, how long before the wizarding world is forced to acknowledge that Muggles aren't as clueless as we like to think. Cassian tapped his fingers, probably when Muggle technology advances to the point where they start asking the right questions. Cassian missed this part of teaching, sitting around, complaining about students with other professors. In his past life, it had been the only real catharsis in chaotic schools. Hogwarts wasn't much different. After a while, Quirrell finished his tea and excused himself. Sinistra already left earlier. That left just Cassian and Bathsheba, the fire casting flickering light across the room as she stifled a yawn. Excuse me, she said, stretching slightly. It is getting late. Cassian waved a hand. Let me walk you to your quarters, lady. She chuckled, shaking her head. My, what a gentleman. They left the staff lounge, stepping into the quiet corridors of Hogwarts. Most of the castle was still awake, students sneaking in last-minute common room chatter, prefects making their rounds, Filch lurking in some shadowy corner with Mrs. Norris. Cassian spotted the sixth years sneaking down the corridor, completely unfazed by his presence. The girl even smiled at him. You know I should punish you for breaking curfew, right? He said, stopping just short of crossing his arms. The Hufflepuff girl grinned. Come on, Professor R, I thought you were cool. Cassian let out a chuckle. Did they really think he would cave just to be cool? Naive. Off to bed before I actually start caring enough to deduct points. The girl booed, and the boy, Charlie Weasley, slumped with a groan. Okay, sir. Cassian shook his head as they turned back. At least they weren't the worst offenders. He caught 5th years last week trying to hex Filch's mop so it would clean on its own. Not a bad idea, really, but also not his problem. Beside him, Bath's Haida watched with an amused glance. You are surprisingly lenient. They weren't causing real trouble. Let them think they got away with something, Cassian said. Keeps them from pushing further. Bath's Haida hummed, unconvinced but not arguing. They kept walking through the dim corridors, the distant echo of laughter and moving staircases filling the castle's usual nighttime quiet. You ever think about taking on an apprentice? She asked. Cassian raised a brow. Why? You looking for a career change? She laughed. Hardly. But the way your students talk, you might as well be building a cult. Cassian snorted. Good to know I am Hogwarts' latest cult leader. What do you think those two were up to? Cassian shot her a look, raising an eyebrow in a very Dumbledore-esque way. I believe we both know what two very hormonal teenagers were up to. Bath's Haida chuckled. Probably. You ever sneak around after curfew when you were a student? She asked. Cassian smirked. Wouldn't you like to know? She rolled her eyes. That is not an answer. I plead the 5th. Bath's Haida huffed a laugh. Wrong country, wrong government. Same principle. She glanced at Cassian, who met her gaze with a smile. I do recall a certain older witch back in my school days, he mused, tilting his head slightly. Always busy, always on some errand. The serious type, intimidating, even. But according to the older boys in my house, quite the heartbreaker. His smiled suggestively. I heard more than a few grumbling about failed attempts to invite you to Hogsmeade. Bath's Haida raised a brow, clearly unimpressed. That was what they told you. That, and a few tragic tales of rejection, Cassian said, stretching out the last word like it was some great tragedy. Apparently, you left a trail of disappointed suitors in your wake. Please. Half of them were insufferable. That sounds about right, he said. Bath's Haida glanced at him. What about you? I don't remember you being particularly. Cassian rolled his eyes, you can say it. I wasn't liked. She gave sympathetic smile, you weren't exactly popular, no. Cassian shrugged. She gave him a knowing look. Didn't stop you from getting attention. Cassian shrugged. Not in a good way. I could barely cast a spell, but I had an ego the size of a divine. Not the best combination. Bath's Haida snorted. Merlin, you must have been such a git. Oh, I was, he said, stretching his arms, arrogance without the talent to back it up. A nightmare. I think half the staff wanted to hex me on sight. Only half. He chuckled. I was a Rosier. Half of them assumed I would grow into the arrogance eventually. The other half probably expected me to be handled before I embarrassed the family too much. How reassuring. He shrugged. I imagine there were some wagers placed. Would I end up disgraced, disowned, or dead before 30? The odds must have been thrilling. She studied him for a moment. Yet here you are, terrorizing students with history lectures instead. Shocking, I know. Cassian shook his head. I can only imagine the family disappointment. Bath's Haida grinned. They must be devastated. He chuckled. Not as much as they would be if they realized I actually enjoy teaching. That made her pause. Not because it was surprising, anyone with half a brain could see Cassian wasn't just going through the motions. It was the way he said it, like he was only just admitting it to himself. You should, she said simply. You are good at it. Cassian tilted his head. Not bad, coming from the runes professor. Bath's Haida rolled her eyes. If I didn't think you were, I wouldn't bother humoring these conversations. He grinned, his eyebrow dancing. So I should be flattered. Immensely. As they reached her door, Bath's Haida stopped, one hand resting lightly against the frame. Cassian raised an eyebrow. What, no invitation? I am wounded. She shook her head with a laugh. I am saving you from the agony of watching me sort through 20 essays on the philosophical applications of runes. Sounds riveting. She gave him a deadpan. You would lose interest the moment someone tried to argue that runes have innate energy rather than being conduits. Always so cruel to a humble historian. I am very invested in the academic brilliance of Hogwarts' finest. Right. I am sure you don't have an entire pile of half-read essays collecting dust somewhere. Not collecting dust, he corrected. Actively mocking me from my desk. She shook her head, half amused, half exasperated. You should go before I start thinking you are stalling. Me? Stalling? Cassian placed a hand over his heart. I would never. Bathsheda's lips twitched, obviously suppressing a laugh, and reached for the door handle. Good night, Cassian. He gave her a lazy salute. Try not to dream about cursed runes. She hummed, pushing the door open. And you try not to fail half your students. Cassian smirked, stepping back. It will be difficult, but I shall. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving him alone in the corridor. Cassian sighed through his nose, shaking his head as he turned away. Chapter 16, Surviving the Year. Hello everyone. It was brought to my attention that the Power Stone rants at the end of my chapters might have come across the wrong way. This one's on me. I now can see how they may have seemed hostile or even insulting, and I want to make it very clear that this was never my intention. For that, I sincerely apologize. In hindsight, I realize I carried over a style of end-of-chapter notes that I used in another FIC, where I had already established a tone and rapport with readers. In that context, people knew I was joking. Most of my long-time readers are familiar with my sense of humor and know these rants are meant to be playful, but in this story, I started using that tone right from the beginning, and I now understand how it might land differently, especially for readers who are new to my work. Thank you for sticking with me and for letting me know how it came across. I appreciate you all. The rest of the year passed in a blur. Cassian went through the curriculum, covering everything from the first-year spells to subjects that weren't technically his responsibility, but if Snape got to terrify students in potions, Cassian saw no issue with throwing in a few history lessons that actually mattered. He made sure they learned the origins of potions, much to Snape's irritation, and walked them through the ancient applications of transfiguration. He covered the history of the dark arts and the defenses wizards had developed over centuries, a topic that had Slytherins and Gryffindors equally engaged for once. Extinct herbs, long-lost magical flora, and their uses found their way into discussions, drawing even Sprout's attention when her students started asking questions she hadn't expected from history of magic. Through it all, he earned a few more variations. Every time he awakened an ancient variation, his mind pulled him into the past. A flicker of something ancient, a spell that had been lost, and then a memory that wasn't his. Spells formed in his thoughts, knowledge settling like it had always been there, waiting. He never experienced the same sensation he felt with Lumos Noctis, though. Whatever had caused that first shift, the eerie pull, the weight of something waking up, never happened again. But the memories didn't stop. By the end of the year, Cassian had a growing list of spells that technically shouldn't exist anymore, glimpses of magic that had shaped history long before wizards had formalized it. Some of it was dangerous, but most of it was just forgotten. A casualty of time, of shifting priorities, of magic being simplified and sanitized for modern use. Not that he was going to hand this knowledge over to the Ministry on a silver platter. Hogwarts carried on as it always did, students whining about assignments, Gryffindors picking fights with Slytherins, Filch chasing after rule breakers with Mrs. Norris at his heels. The castle remained the same, but for Cassian, the way he saw it had changed. Magic wasn't just spells and wand work. It was history, woven into stone and air, stitched into the very foundations of the world. The final weeks of term were the usual mess of exams, last-minute panic, and students trying to squeeze in extra credit. Cassian wasn't about to play nursemaid for last-minute panics. His exam was easy, insultingly so. If anyone failed, that was Darwinism at work. Professor R, said a voice behind him. He looked up to see Nymphadora Tonks flopping into the chair opposite his desk, her hair flickering between bubblegum pink and electric blue like a mood ring that couldn't decide. You are here to negotiate points, aren't you? Cassian said flatly. Me? Tonks pressed a hand to her chest in mock offense. Would I do that? Yes. She grinned. Fair. But no, I am not here to grovel. I am here to gloat. Your exam? Easiest thing I've done all year. Piece of cauldron cake. Cassian tilted his chin. Are you saying my beautifully crafted test didn't crush your soul? I must be losing my edge. I am saying even a troll with a hangover could pass it. Cassian smirked. Good. Maybe next year I will replace you with one and see if it improves the quality of answers. Her hair shifted to a smug shade of neon pink as she leaned back in the chair, balancing it on two legs. Not my fault you asked baby questions. Pick any spell and explain its history and how it was used outside of current trend. Give your original answer on how it can be used differently. Even my mum could answer those, and she doesn't care about history. Most of your classmates didn't find them so baby, Cassian said, flipping through a stack of essays. That is because most of them have the critical thinking skills of flobberworms. Cassian huffed a laugh despite himself. Careful, Tonks. With commentary like that, you are on track to becoming a professor. She pulled a face, her hair turning a sour green. Merlin forbid. I would trip over the desks before the first lesson. Cassian's lips twitched. Accurate. He tapped the parchment in front of him. Speaking of tripping. Did you even remember to sign your exam properly? Of course I did. I wrote Tonks. Full name. He faked a frown. Your full name is Nymphadora Tonks. And don't bother scowling. I saw the look you gave first time I said it. Her hair flared scarlet. Professor. Tonks is my full name. The other one is, a cruel joke inflicted on me by my parents. Nevertheless, Cassian said with infuriating calm, that is the name Hogwarts keeps on record. Which means if you want credit for the exam, you will rewrite it properly signed, unless you want me to give all your points to Miss Tonks, whoever she may be. Tonks groaned dramatically, throwing her head back so far she nearly toppled her chair. You are evil. True. Fine. But if I die of embarrassment writing Nymphadora at the top of my paper, my ghost is going to haunt you. And not even in a fun way. I will rearrange your bookshelves out of spite. Sliding her parchment across the desk, Cassian added with a smile, looking forward to it. Now off you go. Leave me in peace to grade the rest of these essays before I start questioning why I teach at all. Tonks stuck out her tongue and snatched the parchment, signing with 3 hateful underlines. Better stock up on tea, Professor. You will need it. Next, 2 identical first years hovered by his desk, identical grins plastered across their faces. Professor Rosier, one began with the grin of a boy already plotting his own funeral. We were wondering. The other chimed in seamlessly. If you would like to make history, by being the first professor to say yes to us. No. Both froze. You didn't even let us ask, Fred protested, as though deeply wounded. Cassian didn't look up from the stack of essays in front of him. I don't need to. Whatever it is, the answer is no. But what if, hypothetically, we were being reasonable for once? George countered, grinning like it was the greatest lie ever told. You are not. Fred crossed his arms. At least let us pitch our plan first. I don't have to. You are identical, you finish each other's sentences, and your idea of fun probably involves fireworks in the Great Hall. Whatever you are plotting, the answer is still no. George's grin widened. So you are saying if we were plotting, you would know. Cassian finally looked up, fixing them with a flat stare. If? Don't insult my intelligence. You two were born plotting. Fred elbowed George. Told you he would say that. George grinned impishly. All right, Professor. What about an extra assignment? We are willing to work for it. No. Fred sighed dramatically. Come on, you don't even know what we want extra credit for. You are first years, Cassian said, returning his attention to the essays. There is nothing you could possibly want extra credit for that wouldn't involve some ill-advised scheme or a prank I would have to clean up later. George pouted. So that is it. No chance at redemption. Cassian didn't even glance up. No redemption. No chance. No deal. Go torment someone else. Fred and George exchanged looks, then identical mischievous grins spread across their faces. All right then, Professor Rosier, Fred said. You win this round, George finished. Cassian fought to urge to sigh, already regretting every choice that had led him to teaching first years. Get out before I decide to assign you both a 2-foot essay on the unfortunate poltergeists and their gruesome ends. Fred opened his mouth, no doubt to fire off some cheeky retort, but before he could, a voice cut across the room. Fred. George. Out. Now. Charlie Weasley appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, looking every inch the responsible older brother. Both twins froze mid-step. "Charlie!" Fred said brightly, as if his arrival was the best thing to happen all day. "Hey, Charlie," George added, grinning. "We were just about to leave," Charlie interrupted firmly, grabbing them each by the back of their collars like a pair of misbehaving measles. "Professor Rosier, I am sorry about them," Charlie said with a weary smile. "They are, a lot." Cassian raised an eyebrow. "A lot is putting it kindly." Fred wiggled in his brother's grip. "We weren't causing that much trouble," George chimed in. "Just a little negotiation for extra credit." Charlie gave them both a tug. "Extra credit? You are first years." Merlin's beard, "Are you trying to set a record for annoying staff?" "They started early," Cassian remarked dryly. "At this rate, they will have half the castle hexing them by third year." "That is what we are afraid of," Charlie said with a sigh. He tightened his hold on the twins and gave Cassian an apologetic look. "Sorry again, Professor. I will keep them out of your hair." Cassian chuckled. "Good luck with that. Those two were born to get into people's hair, and set it on fire for fun." "True," Charlie admitted, dragging the twins toward the door. "Bye, Professor R." Fred called cheerfully. "Don't miss us too much," George added. Cassian raised a hand lazily. "I will try to cope." Charlie herded them out, the sound of the twins bickering fading down the corridor. Cassian shook his head and muttered, "Hogwarts really doesn't pay me enough for this." With the worst of the grading out of the way, Cassian stretched and leaned back in his chair. He enjoyed teaching, but if he had to read another essay where someone tried to claim Merlin invented every spell in existence, he might actually set something on fire. Merlin invented every spell in existence. He read aloud, as if that would make it less ridiculous. It didn't. A knock at the door made him glance up. Bath's Haida babbling leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "Survived. Barely." Cassian shut the last essay with a sigh. "Please tell me Ancient Runes essays are better than this." She smiled softly. "Marginally. No one tried to claim Merlin invented runes, at least. Lucky you." She stepped into the room, glancing at the pile of parchment. "Planning to spend the holidays buried under all this?" Cassian stacked the essays into a neat pile. "Better than spending it with the Rosiers." Bathsheda's eyes brightened as she leaned forward. "I got an invitation to a dig site. They uncovered an ancient runic language, one no one's seen before. Thought you might be interested." She watched him expectantly. Cassian raised a brow. "You want me to tag along while you poke at old rocks?" She huffed, unimpressed. "They are not just rocks. This could change everything we know about magical linguistics. Dangerous words. Half the field loses their minds when you suggest anything older than the Egyptian hieroglyphs." "Exactly." She sat near him. "Figured you would enjoy the chaos. You seem to thrive in it." He tapped a finger against the desk, considering. The truth was, he was interested. Anything predating established magical history was worth looking into, and if the language was truly unknown, it meant magic older than modern spellcraft. That, and, though he wouldn't say it outright, he enjoyed spending time with her. Over the months, their relationship shifted. They weren't quite friends, not in the way most people meant, but there was an ease between them now. A habit of finding each other in the staff lounge, sharing drinks in Hogsmeade, or staying up late discussing their work. Neither had put a name to it, and Cassian saw no reason to. Whatever it was, it worked. "Where is the site?" "Norway. Just outside Trondheim." She watched him, waiting. "Well." He smiled. "I would love to." Bath's Haida lit up. "We leave a week after term ends." Chapter 17, Curse. Sitting in the Great Hall for the end-of-year feast, Cassian looked up at the green banners stretched all the way up to ceiling. Slytherin had taken both the House Cup and the Quidditch Cup, their table roared with celebration. The other houses put up with it, some more patiently than others. Ravenclaws weren't really bothered, Hufflepuffs clapped politely, of course, and Gryffindors sulked like someone had personally insulted their ancestors. It was a familiar sight, but Cassian had no real attachment to it. The old Cassian was a Slytherin, but that had nothing to do with him. If he was sorted now, he doubted he would end up in the same house. Most likely Ravenclaw, something Bath's Haida had pointed out more than once in passing conversation. I am still not convinced you weren't meant for my house, she had said during one of their staff room chats. Slytherin ambition aside, you are far too invested in knowledge to have survived among them. Cassian had just laughed and shrugged. A shame, then. Could have saved your lot from turning into glorified human encyclopedias. Now, watching the Slytherin table roar with triumph while the rest of the hall resigned itself to another year of them lording it over everyone, he found himself mildly grateful for his current position. Teaching had its headaches, but at least he didn't have to deal with house rivalries like a 15-year-old with something to prove. Dumbledore stood, raising a hand for silence, and the hall gradually settled. The usual speech followed, congratulations, reminders, well wishes for the summer. At some point, Cassian's mind drifted to Norway. He had no idea what exactly they would find at the dig site, but if it was enough to get Bath's Haida excited, it had to be worth the trip. After the feast, the students scattered to their common rooms. Cassian lingered over his tea, enjoying the rare quiet and the absence of students screaming about house points like it determined their immortal souls. Most of the staff had already left, save for McGonagall, who was speaking with Flitwick near the doors. Snape had vanished almost immediately after the feast ended, no doubt retreating to wherever he spent his free time being unpleasant. Bath's Haida lingered nearby, glancing over at him. Still in one piece after your first year teaching? Cassian smirked. Barely. I am convinced some of these students are actively trying to kill my enthusiasm. She chuckled. Consider it a test of endurance. Perfect. Just what I dreamed of as a child. On the bright side, you survived, and now you get a summer away from it. She tapped her fingers against the back of his chair. Though, instead of resting, you decided to spend it knee-deep in ancient runes. Rest is overrated, Cassian said. Besides, this is the first interesting thing to pop up in a while. Bath's Haida raised an eyebrow. Glad to know our company is so engaging. Cassian grinned. You know what I mean. Hogwarts is fascinating, but it is still a school. The past year has been spent wrangling teenagers into caring about things that happened centuries before their great-great-grandparents were born. He leaned back slightly. It will be nice to get out and see something older than castle walls and hormonal dramas. She hummed. Fair enough. Just don't complain when you are stuck translating runes in the rain. I will suffer through it. The conversation moved on, drifting between speculation on the dig site and the general absurdities of the past year. By the time they left the hall, most of the castle had gone quiet, students either asleep or making the most of their last night before heading home. Cassian didn't bother returning to his quarters immediately. Instead, he took a slow walk through the corridors, passing by empty classrooms and torch-lit hallways. Hogwarts at night had a different feel, less bustling, more ancient, the weight of history pressing in through every stone. He found himself by the library without meaning to. The doors were closed, but he knew Madame Pants was still inside. He could hear the faint sound of pages turning, the occasional rustle of fabric as she moved about. For a moment, he considered knocking. He had a few books to return, but decided against it. But just as Cassian turned to leave, a sharp scream cut through the quiet. He was moving before he even processed it, legs carrying him forward as he shoved open the library doors. The sound had come from the restricted section. He didn't bother being quiet as he moved. The tall bookshelves were blocking his path like a literary maze, and then he saw her. Professor Helena Mulford lay sprawled on the ground, her body stiff, her skin darkened, not burnt, but twisted by some curse. Cassian dropped to a knee, gripping his wand tight. Finite. A standard counter curse, but he forced as much power into it as he could. He hadn't taught this to students yet, and unlike his other spell discoveries, there was no ancient variation sitting in his mind, waiting to be recalled. He knew only this. His pulse of magic washed over Mulford. Whatever inky curse was on her skin, it started to recede, but she was still as stiff. Her breathing was faint, but there. Thankfully, she was alive. Cassian swore under his breath. Pants. He called. Madame Pants was already next to him, having rushed over at the sound of the scream. Her wand moved over them, casting detection spells over Mulford's body. Cassian watched as her expression darkened with each passing second. Before he could ask what she saw, the doors banged open. McGonagall and Dumbledore strode in, followed closely by Flitwick, Sprout, and Snape. Cassian had no idea how they'd been alerted so quickly, but now wasn't the time to ask. Dumbledore took one glance at the scene before stepping forward. Madame Pants. Pants's lips were pressed into a thin line. She was cursed. Something old. Not the usual dark magic one might expect. She flicked her wand again, scanning Mulford's body, then exhaled sharply. It is not active anymore, but whatever it was nearly killed her. McGonagall knelt beside Mulford, pressing her fingers lightly against the woman's wrist. She is alive, but barely. Her gaze flicked up to Cassian. What happened? Cassian straightened. I heard a scream and found her like this. Snape's eyes narrowed. And yet, you are unharmed. Cassian shot him a flat look. Yes, Severus, because I clearly hexed a colleague and then stuck around to admire my work. McGonagall ignored them both. Did you see anything else? Nothing, Cassian said. I cast Finite, and it seemed to slow the curse, but that is all. Flitwick had been inspecting Mulford closely, muttering under his breath. Now, he straightened, his usual cheer was nowhere to seen. This wasn't an ordinary curse. This was layered magic, something meant to spread, not just kill outright. Sprout glanced at Flitwick. You are thinking the same thing I am, aren't you? Flitwick gave a small nod. Defense against the dark arts. They all quietened, as if they knew a secret. McGonagall's mouth pressed into a thin line. Again. Dumbledore sighed through his nose, his gaze fixed on Mulford. It does appear to follow a pattern. Cassian frowned. What pattern? Sprout glanced at him, then at the others, as if deciding whether or not to say it. The curse on the defense position. Cassian stared. You are joking. It is real. Flitwick shook his head. It is no secret that the defense against the dark arts post has been unstable for some time now. No professor lasts more than a year. McGonagall adjusted her spectacles. And now, this. She gestured at Mulford's unconscious form. Cassian resisted the urge to swear. You are telling me there is a bloody curse on the job itself. Dumbledore met his gaze evenly. That is the prevailing theory. He snorted out a breath. Right. So, let me get this straight. Hogwarts has had a cursed teaching position for at least a decade, since I remember professors coming and going every year, and no one thought to fix it. Snape scoffed. You think fixing ancient curses is as simple as waving a wand and reciting a nursery rhyme? Cassian gave him a look. I don't know, Severus, maybe don't keep tossing professors into the meat grinder and hoping for different results? Do you even inform them before recruiting them to their possible deaths? McGonagall pinched the bridge of her nose. Enough. She turned to Pants. Can she be moved? Pants hesitated, then nodded. The curse isn't active anymore. Madame Pomfrey should be able to stabilize her. Dumbledore flicked his wand, and Mulford's body lifted gently into the air. Minerva, if you would accompany me to the hospital wing. McGonagall gave a nod and followed as Dumbledore guided Mulford out of the library. The rest of the staff lingered, their gazes still on Cassian. Flitwick frowned. No sign of the attacker, then. Cassian shook his head. Nothing. Just her. Sprout sighed, rubbing her temples. Then there is little else we can do tonight. Snape huffed. Wonderful. Another year, another cursed defense professor. Cassian left the library, hands in his pockets, walking the dim corridors toward his room. The curse on the defense against the dark arts position. He heard about it during his school days, well, the other Cassian school days, but he assumed it was just the usual nonsense students spread around. A way to make Hogwarts sound more dangerous than it already was. But seeing Mulford barely breathing on the library floor? That wasn't a theory. Every year, the professor in that position either dropped dead, vanished, or was forced out under increasingly bizarre circumstances. It was cursed. Literally. He clenched his fist. At least no one would bother cursing the history of magic position, he muttered. Not that it would have made much difference. History wasn't exactly a high-risk job. Nobody got themselves killed explaining goblin treaties. Oh wait, Binns did, but that was on him. At worst, he would bore someone to death. Probably Snape. Chapter 18, Bloody Historians. Year ended, and Cassian took the train from Hogsmeade with the students, not because he had to, but because operating was beyond him, and calling a house elf just to fetch him home was too much effort. Besides, he liked trains. The steady rhythm, the muted conversations leaking between compartments, the scenery flashing past, it was oddly grounding, a quiet simplicity magic never managed to replicate. The Hogwarts Express was loud, as always. Younger students chattered excitedly about summer plans, older ones slumped in their seats, exhausted from exams. A few prefects made a half-hearted attempt to maintain order, but no one cared. The term was over, and discipline was left behind at the castle. Cassian sat with a couple of second years in his compartment, flipping through a book he borrowed from the library, one he conveniently forgotten to return before leaving. Madame Pants would probably lecture him about it later. But it wasn't his fault. The night he was deliberating whether to return them, Mulford was cursed. The train pulled into King's Cross, and Cassian stepped onto the platform, blending easily into the flow of students reuniting with their families. Lucian was waiting near the exit, looking as well put together as ever with his dark robe. His younger cousin, Odette, stood beside him, hands tucked into the pockets of her cloak. Her blue eyes flicked to Cassian, unimpressed, before she turned her attention back to Lucian, as if he was the only one worth acknowledging. Arriving at the waiting cluster of Rosiers, Cassian lifted a hand in an easy wave. "You lot go ahead. I will take public transport." Lucian raised a brow, unimpressed. "What, the night bus? Feeling adventurous?" Selina looked intrigued for half a second but seemed to decide against commenting. Odette, however, wrinkled her nose in that particularly disdainful way only a 12-year-old could manage. "The elves are here, cousin. Don't be difficult." Cassian snorted and reached out, ruffling her perfectly arranged platinum hair before she could dodge. "Don't worry about me, Odette." She let out a sharp huff, stepping away as she smoothed her hair back into place, eyes blazing with indignation. "You are the worst." "Family trait," he said with a grin, stepping past her before she could try to retaliate. Lucian shook his head, clearly considering whether Cassian was even worth engaging with, but ultimately didn't bother. "You will regret it," was all he said before turning on his heel and heading towards the apparition area, Odette following after him. Selina lingered, studying Cassian with something between amusement and curiosity. "Muggle buses and trains, really?" He shrugged. "Why not? Hogwarts Express was fine. Might as well complete the experience." Selina smiled softly. "Just don't get lost. You've spent most of your life being operated around. I am sure I will manage." She gave him one last glance before following the rest of the family, leaving Cassian standing in the middle of King's Cross, watching as the Rosier contingent disappeared into the crowd. Cassian made a quick stop at the ministry to exchange some galleons for quid. Where he was going, if it existed at all, wouldn't accept anything but crisp notes. He took the underground. Partly because he could, partly because he missed watching how Muggles functioned without magic. The station bustled with the usual rush hour chaos, businessmen in suits, tired mothers wrangling children, teenagers clumped together in loud, laughing groups. The train arrived with a screech of brakes, and he stepped inside, finding a corner to lean against as the carriage jerked forward. After a few stops, he changed lines, slipping through the station like he'd done it 1,000 times, because he had. The tube map looked like chaos to most people, all crisscrossed colors and angles, but to him it made sense. Knew where to stand, where the doors opened, where the crowds bunched up. Eventually, he arrived at the location he had in mind. Whether it existed in this world was another matter, but his target was a small, tucked-away bookshop he often visited in his past life. Stepping outside, Cassian glanced up at the sign. "Tanner's Rare Books and Maps." "Hey! Still here?" He pushed open the door, and the familiar scent of old paper and ink hit him instantly. The place was exactly as he remembered. Dimly lit, shelves stacked haphazardly with books, the faint sound of a crackling radio playing from the back. The owner, an elderly man, sat behind the counter, flipping through a ledger. He glanced up, giving Cassian a quick once-over. "Looking for something specific?" Cassian stepped further inside, eyes scanning the spines. "Old texts. Preferably pre-civilization." The old man hummed, standing with a creak of joints. "Follow me." Cassian trailed after him through the narrow aisles until they reached the back, where a locked cabinet held the more valuable collections. The owner pulled out a key, unlocked it, and stepped aside. "Help yourself. Prices aren't negotiable." Cassian nearly blurted out, "I know, old man," before catching himself. He had to remind himself that, in this life, this was his first time meeting Yehen Tanner. Still, it was a shock to see him looking just as ancient as he had a quarter of a century later in Cassian's past life. How old is he? Cassian wondered, but he let it go. Probably best not to question it. He turned his attention to the books instead. The titles on the shelves were familiar, their worn covers and spines bringing back memories of long nights spent reading in another life. Seeing them here, unchanged, solidified a strange truth: history seemed to have played out the same way, despite the existence of magic. No butterfly effect, no rewritten past. He chuckled to himself. Magic must have decided history wasn't worth tampering with. Shaking his head, Cassian reached for a book. History of Ancient Magic. Not an actual magic book, of course, just a historical fiction novel about the myths and beliefs surrounding magical practices in different cultures. He read it in his past life when it had been nothing more than speculation. But here? Here, it might actually hold something real. Good choice, Yahen muttered, watching him as he flipped through the pages. That one's been around for a while. Cassian glanced up. How old is this copy? Yahen scratched his chin, thinking. That edition? About 80 years. Cassian whistled. Not bad. He kept flipping through, scanning for anything that might stand out. If nothing else, it would be interesting to compare this world's historical interpretation of magic with what he knew from before. Yahen leaned back against the counter. You a historian? Cassian smirked. Something like that. Good. Means you might actually appreciate the books rather than just collecting them for show. Cassian closed the book with a quiet thump. You would be surprised how many people think owning a shelf full of old books makes them an expert. Yahen huffed. More than I care to count. After a few more minutes of browsing, Cassian gathered a small stack and carried them to the counter. Yahen Tanner glanced up from his ledger, eyes narrowing slightly as he checked the books Cassian picked. He thumbed through the titles, giving a small grunt of approval at one or two before lighting a cigarette with a flick of his battered old lighter. Cassian raised an eyebrow. Smoking in a bookshop. Tanner exhaled a slow stream of smoke, entirely unbothered. Been doing it longer than you've been alive, lad? Cassian shook his head, eyeing the cigarette like it was a personal offense. I swear, you are one stray ember away from committing a crime on par with burning the Library of Alexandria. The old man's glare was one Cassian had seen before. In his past life, he argued with Yahen Tanner more times than he could count about the idiocy of smoking in a shop full of ancient books. Once, he called the man a sinner on par with those who burned the Library of Alexandria. Tanner was so livid he'd shaken for an hour. Now, decades earlier but just as stubborn, Tanner's face twisted with fury, his thin lips curling back like a dog about to bite. His hands, worn from years of flipping pages and counting coins, trembled as he jabbed a finger at Cassian. You dare compare those book-burning, knowledge-desecrating, barbaric heathens to my smoking? Are you mad, boy? Mad. His voice cracked with sheer outrage. You think I am some ignorant fool, setting fire to history? Think, boy. These books have lived longer than you, longer than your entire bloody lineage, and you think a little smoke is the end of them. He slammed a palm down on the counter, rattling the books stacked beside him. Blasphemy. Heresy. Utter intellectual sacrilege. Cassian, suppressing the laughter that was on verge of bursting, leaned casually on the counter like a man enjoying fine theatre. I am just saying, sir, one stray ember and you would be a walking historical tragedy. Imagine the obituary. Bookshop owner goes up in flames alongside priceless literature. Tanner scoffed, muttering something vicious under his breath as he grabbed a scrap of paper and scrawled out a number in quick, sharp strokes. He shoved it across the counter with a glare that could have wrought flesh. That is your price. And don't try haggling, I will throw you out. Cassian glanced at the number. 28 quid. A steal, really, considering the quality of the books he was walking away with. He pulled out a few notes, dropping them onto the counter. Pleasure doing business. Tanner snatched up the money, tucking it away with a grumble. Bloody historians. Smug little parasites living off the sweat of real collectors. Always think they are the clever ones. Getting a reaction out of the old man was always worth it. And now, knowing the stubborn bastard might still be alive in another 25 years, Cassian wasn't worried about shortening his lifespan with a bit of provocation. He laughed, waving a lazy hand over his shoulder as he stepped away. Say hi to L'Oreal. The words had barely left his mouth before he realized his mistake. His blood went cold. Shit. Chapter 19, Family. Yehen Tanner didn't have a grown granddaughter helping him around the shop yet. L'Oreal was probably a toddler right now, maybe not even walking. Cassian shouldn't have known that name. Worse, he shouldn't have said it. Cassian's stomach dropped as his mind raced. L'Oreal Tanner was 25 in his past life. That meant, he did some quick calculations, she wasn't even born yet. Phew. Tanner's voice cut through his thoughts. Who the hell is L'Oreal? Cassian laughed. Haha, sorry. I was singing in my head, gotta see the rainy day, follow the dream to skies so pale, drift with the winds that set the sail. He grinned. Say hi to L'Oreal. Yehen Tanner narrowed his eyes. What? Cassian shrugged, still smirking. Just a tune. You know how it is, sometimes a line gets stuck in your head, and it comes out before you think. Tanner didn't look convinced. His gaze lingered on Cassian a little too long, the kind of look an old man gives when deciding if someone is bullshitting him. Then, finally, he huffed, taking a drag from his cigarette. Bloody historians. Always talking in riddles. Cassian chuckled and stepped out of the bookshop, the day already setting. Tanner's grumbling faded behind him, though he didn't doubt the old man would still be muttering insults long after he was gone. He slung the bag now carrying his books over his shoulder and made his way to the underground. The journey back was quiet, the late hour thinning out the usual crowds. By the time he reached Rosier Manor, the sky had settled into deep black, the estate looming ahead like some relic from a dark fantasy. Inside, the usual scent of expensive food and something faintly floral, probably whatever enchantment his mother insisted on having refreshed daily. He barely had time to set his bag down before a house elf appeared at his elbow, bowing stiffly. Dinner is served, Master Cassian, the elf said, bowing deeply. Cassian crouched, eyeing the small, hunched figure in front of him. How are you doing, Tal? It's been a while. The house elf flinched at being addressed, his large, bat-like ears twitching as he kept his gaze firmly on the floor. Cassian sighed. The old Cassian had terrorized the poor creature so much that a simple smile or kind word was met with wariness, as if a kick might follow at any moment. Cassian held out the bag he was carrying. Put these on my desk. Tal took them quickly, his thin fingers curling around the strap as he scurried away without a word. Cassian watched him go. He shook it off and walked towards the dining table. Another elf appeared at his side, silently helping him clean his hands with magic before he sat down. The entire Rosier family was gathered tonight, as expected for the first meal after the school term ended. The long dining table stretched before him, lined with polished silverware and pristine plates. Cassian slid into his seat, taking a look around. His grandfather, Magnus, sat at the head of the table, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room like a man still used to holding power, despite his retirement. His grandmother, Catherine, perched beside him, thin-lipped and stiff, always radiating omni-disapproval. His father, Regulus, was in a hushed conversation with Lucian, likely discussing some ministry business Cassian couldn't be bothered to care about. His mother, Ophelia, sat across from him, elegant as ever, though her attention was fixed on her plate, as if even looking at Cassian might be a waste of time. The rest of the family filled the seats in their usual places. Uncles, aunts, cousins, each one with their own ambitions, each one knowing exactly where they ranked in the unspoken hierarchy of the Rosiers. Cassian, as always, was at the bottom. Dinner began, the house elves moving seamlessly through the room. Cassian ate without rush, half listening to the murmured conversations around him. Armand, his stocky, broad-shouldered uncle, broke the relative quiet. Lucian, I hear you handled the Selwyn incident well. Didn't even leave a trace. Lucian lifted his head, his usual self-satisfied smirk tugging at his lips. The Aurors never even got a whiff of it. Armand chuckled. Good. The last thing we need is more ministry oversight. Cassian speared a piece of roasted pheasant, taking his time chewing before he spoke. Shame. I was hoping for a thrilling scandal to read about in the Prophet. Lucian lightly scoffed, unimpressed. It is a family matter, Cassian. Something you wouldn't understand. Cassian smirked. You are right. I can't say I have much experience in covering up whatever it is you lot get up to these days. Spare us your ignorance, Viola, his aunt, cut in, sharp eyes locking onto him like a predator finding weak prey. You've been playing professor for a year now, haven't you? Tell me, how does it feel to be surrounded by children who probably surpass you in magical ability? Cassian swirled his tea lazily. Not as humiliating as watching you desperately cling to relevance in a family that's already moved on from you. A faint snort came from somewhere down the table, possibly Selena, though she covered it well by taking a sip of her drink. Viola's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she turned to Magnus. It is a wonder you still allow him to waste the family name like this, father. Magnus silenced Viola with a sharp glance before turning to Cassian. His placement at Hogwarts was decided by Regulus and me. And from what I hear, he's done well, teaching students to question the so-called friendship between wizards and muggles. That alone makes his presence there worthwhile. Cassian kept his expression neutral, taking a slow sip of tea. He had no doubt Magnus had sources feeding him reports, but it was amusing how the man had twisted his approach. Teaching history properly, without whitewashing, without simplifying, wasn't the same as pushing pure-blood superiority. This was his task to begin with. Regulus and Magnus had placed him at Hogwarts with a clear expectation, subtly reinforced the Rosier worldview. From the outside, it looked like he was doing exactly that. He taught history with all its uncomfortable truths, questioning the so-called harmony between wizards and muggles. But what he was actually doing was pushing them to think for themselves. To question everything. It wasn't about feeding them a new ideology, it was about making them realize there wasn't just one. Cassian basked in Viola's face, and let Magnus believe whatever he wanted. A necessary perspective, his grandfather continued, nodding slightly. The younger generation is too quick to accept revisionist history. They need to be reminded of the past as it truly was. Viola forced a smile. Then at least he is serving some purpose. Cassian turned his head lazily towards her. That is right. You should be thrilled. For the first time in my life, I am actually useful. Regulus ended the conversation before anyone else could comment on it. Your position at Hogwarts is valuable, Cassian. You did well. Cassian smiled faintly, lifting his glass in mock salute. For now, he played along, letting them think he was exactly where they wanted him, guiding young minds in the right direction, reinforcing the Rosier worldview. If they wanted to believe he was molding little Rosier foot soldiers for the next generation, let them. The truth was far less convenient. It was going to be a rude awakening. But not yet. He would wait. The longer he stayed, the more entrenched he became, the harder it would be to remove him. And when the time came, when he had enough credibility, enough standing that not even Magnus or Regulus could make Dumbledore cast him out, he would cut ties for good. The conversation moved on, shifting to ministry affairs and business dealings, none of which interested Cassian in the slightest. Armand and Alistair discussed recent policy changes that could impact their less-than-legal ventures, while Damien offered insights on Wisengamot politics. The following week passed without much incident. Cassian did his best to avoid the worst of his relatives, keeping his head down and making himself as uninteresting as possible, something he had perfected in the past year. The Rosiers were too busy with their own affairs to pay him much mind beyond the occasional dig about his teaching hobby, which he let roll off his back. By the time he was ready to leave, he had to go through the usual performance of asking for permission, which was mostly for show. Magnus barely acknowledged it beyond a vague nod, and Regulus only cared enough to remind him to represent the family properly. Cassian assured them he would, though they probably wouldn't be thrilled with his actual plans. With that, he left Rosier Manor behind, making his way to meet up with Baths Haida. They met at the Port KS station near the ministry, where she was already waiting with her luggage and a bundle of documents tucked under her arm. Cassian eyed the stack. Are you planning to read ancient runes mid-Port KS? He asked. Baths Haida smiled. If I get bored enough. Chapter 20, Ancient Cave. The Port KS, a battered suitcase scarred from years of abuse, lurched violently, yanking Cassian and Baths Haida forward. A heartbeat later, Cassian's boots slammed onto solid ground, the sharp, frigid air of Norway biting at his face. Baths Haida landed gracefully, adjusting her bag like teleporting to another country was just another Thursday. Cassian stumbled, catching himself with a muttered curse. Still feels like my insides rearranged every bloody time, Cassian muttered, brushing off his coat and trying to look like he hadn't just been spun through a cosmic blender. He casually kicked a patch of grass off his boot like that would undo the disgraceful landing. It was his first time. Old Cassian experienced this before, both apparition and Port KS travel, but this was the first time he blinked and ended up thousands of kilometers away. Reading memories was one thing. Living them was a whole different beast. Before the trip, he checked over the old Cassian's memories. How Portkeys twisted through the gut like a sinkhole of suction, how apparition punched behind the eyes and pulled at the ribs like a tug-of-war between dimensions. Old Cassian remembered the sensation as something like being folded in half at the stomach, then siphoned through himself in two violent directions. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't magical. It was mechanical terror masquerading as transportation. Simply, awful. Best Cassian could describe it. Imagine being turned to spaghetti at the edge of a black hole and spat out the other end like some smug, indifferent white hole had coughed you into a different universe. Not that he experienced either. Magic was no different. Cassian saw the flashes of memories, old Cassian's attempts in charms and hexes. He knew how it should feel. Knew the muscle pull of a proper charm. But knowing wasn't casting. It wasn't instinctive, not like it had been in those memories. The best he could explain it was like trying to describe how breathing worked. Could words ever capture the feeling? If anything, they only made it worse. Humans, when made to think about breathing, often lost the instinctive ability to do it. Something they did even in their dreams. Most just covered it up with snoring, but still. This Cassian had to learn what breath was again. Old Cassian's reflexes weren't transferable, not that he had many to begin with. The raw knowledge? Sure. Minimal, still. But it was there. You will survive, Bathsheba replied dryly, scanning the dark horizon. Come on. Camp is this way. The site lay just outside Trondheim, shielded from Muggle eyes by thick layers of enchantments. The magical outpost was busy with movement already, witches and wizards darting between tents and rune-carved stones, parchment rustling in the cold wind. Some bent over artifacts, others whispered furiously over scrolls as if the words themselves might bite back. Bathsheba moved to join the fray, cutting a line through the bustle. Cassian followed at a slower pace, hands in his pockets, eyes flicking lazily over the surroundings like he wasn't cataloging every detail. A man in thick furs waved them over. Professor babbling, I presume. His accent was heavy Norwegian, wand tucked in his pocket like an absent-minded quill. And you must be Professor Rosier. Cassian gave a polite smile. That would be me. Eric Osland, lead researcher and clearly the kind of man who would stab someone with a quill if they mishandled a rune, led them to the dig site. A partially unearthed mountain wall sprawled before them, its walls lined with carvings Cassian didn't recognize. The air brimming with magic, so heavy that even he felt it crawl across his skin. Bathsheba crouched immediately, fingers tracing delicate lines over the stone. Not Elder Futhark, she murmured. Or any known derivative. Cassian knelt beside her, his eyes narrowing. These shapes. He murmured. He wasn't just a historian by trade, he was obsessed with ancient languages. Hieroglyphs, cuneiform, proto-scripts, anything scratched, inked, or carved millennia ago, he researched. He still had the image of a Sumerian tablet burned into his mind, a sliver of a fragment he once owned. He once even owned a small limestone from Göbekli Tepe, worn smooth by hands that had used it over 10,000 years ago. Simple tools, maybe. But they spoke of people, rituals, lives, things that outlasted words. Those two relics weren't just treasures. They were proof of how far his obsession ran. He had spent a fortune to acquire them, burning through savings and sense alike, unable to resist the pull of the ancient. Forgotten scripts, dead tongues, markings barely anyone could piece together, he craved them all, chasing them like a man possessed, enough to call himself a proper historian and almost believe it. But the carvings in front of him? Not Old Norse. Not even younger Futhark. Not anything he recognized. The shapes twisted like they wanted to be a language, but if they weren't one he'd ever seen. And he'd seen plenty. He brushed some loose grit away. The edges of the runes were knife-sharp, untouched. Anything this old should have worn smooth long ago. Most scripts this ancient were worn down, half erased by wind or water or careless hands. These looked like they'd been cut yesterday. He reached out and touched one. The instant his finger met the stone, the world tilted violently sideways. A storm hammered the coastline, black waves crashing against jagged rocks, sea spray lashing up in icy sheets. A small village lay in the crook of a fjord, its houses hunched against the wind like beaten animals. Sparse firelight trembled behind a handful of windows. Beyond it, high on the cliffs, a woman stood at the mouth of a cave. barefoot. Arms streaked in runes, didn't seem like inked, but carved. Her hair clung to her skin, soaked and tangled. Her eyes weren't human, too bright, too sharp. The storm circled her like a loyal beast. Voices shouted beneath her. Men climbed the path, weapons drawn. Runes glowed on her arms. The stone around her began to shake. The men shouted warnings. Threats. Prayers. She didn't answer. She raised both arms, the runes carved into her flesh bleeding crimson radiance. A dragon's roar split the storm. Then, the cave mouth folded in on itself, stone flowing like molten wax, hardening with a sound like 1,000 bones snapping shut. The storm died. Silence. Then the woman was gone. Cassian jerked back like he touched fire. His fingers stung. The rune he touched was warm. Bathsheba was kneeling beside another stone a few feet away. She didn't notice his reaction. A few other researchers were murmuring nearby, too distracted with their own translations to look up. Something stirred deep within him. Same feeling as when he learned Lumos Noctis. Like the world had tilted slightly and no one else noticed. Something shifted. He couldn't say what, but it was there, tugging at the back of his mind like a loose thread waiting to be pulled. Cassian stayed crouched, fingers still hovering near the rune. The heat faded, but the memory didn't. A torrent of memory, hours of someone else's life flooded into him within a heartbeat. The smell of salt, wet stone, her eyes. He blinked, then quietly sorted through it. It wasn't like a seer's vision. It wasn't like learning an ancient spell. This had weight. A presence that wasn't his but clung to his bones anyway. And the name, he hadn't heard it in the vision, but it dropped into his mouth like it had always been there, carved behind his teeth. Yrsa, he muttered. His chest tightened. A sudden shriek cut through the wind, so sharp, it silenced the entire camp. Head snapped up. Tools hit the ground. One of the younger researchers bolted toward the source, already shouting something in Norwegian. Cassian was already running with Bathsheba, boots slamming against the uneven ground. His stomach twisted the moment he recognized where the sound had come from. The cave. It was exactly the same one from the vision. Before, he only saw the cliffside, the mouth of the cave blocked by the slope and thick rock. Now, the way was clear. And he didn't like it. Another researcher caught up beside him. That sounded like Hilda. Cassian didn't know who Hilda was, but the air around the cave felt wrong. Too quiet. Even the wind seemed to have pulled back. He gripped his wand tighter and ducked inside. The entrance widened for two people to walk side by side. The stone underfoot was damp, the cave lit only by the flickering glow of their wands. The rest of the group stayed outside, shouting, calling names. Further in, something glittered faintly in the dark. Then they saw her. Hilda, one of the junior researchers, collapsed on the floor, eyes wide, body frozen in a twisted, half-curled shape. Not unconscious but stiff. Completely rigid, like she'd been turned into a statue mid-fall. Her wand lay a few feet away. Bathsheba crouched next to her, fingers already moving over Hilda's arm. She is breathing. Cassian looked around. The walls of the cave were carved with the same runes, but deeper in, they started to shift. The shapes bent, angles sharper, cuts cleaner. More recent, somehow. It didn't make any sense. She was doing a rub of the inner wall. I told her not to go in alone. Another German scholar stopped, eyes narrowing. This isn't ordinary paralysis. Cassian looked further in, following the line of runes as they formed a spiral. Definitely leading somewhere. The damp stone underfoot gave way to a smoother surface, as if the spiral had been carved to guide a particular kind of traveler. He crouched to trace the faint grooves. Bathsheba hovered behind him, wand lit, her breath puffing in little clouds. It is leading, she said, as though stating the obvious. She knelt, pressing her palm beside his, the runes glowing faintly in response. They crept deeper. The spiral wound tighter, turning until it pointed straight down a narrow corridor. A faint draft curled around Cassian's neck, cold and wet, like a breath that didn't belong to him. He glanced over his shoulder at Bathsheba. She gave a small nod. A single torch flickered ahead, casting shadows that danced with the runes. Cassian tipped his head. That is not natural. Or it is an invitation, Bathsheba said. Her grip on her wand tightened. Quickly, they passed the torch. The circle of illumination steadied on a shallow alcove. There, set into the wall, was a block of stone, its face blank except for a single rune, a symbol neither of them could recognize. Cassian crouched again. The shape reminded him of a curled serpent, mouth open, fangs bared. He tapped it lightly. At once the runes on the spiral flared, and a low hum reverberated through the chamber. Something moved in the shadows, soft, subtle, like a whisper brushing the back of his neck. He turned instinctively to check. Nothing. Just Bathsheba watching him, brows drawn low. He met her gaze. Did you hear? He cut himself off, moving forward before she could answer. He tapped the serpent rune once more. The wall shuddered. A panel slid aside, revealing a narrow shaft. The runes throbbed faintly from within, like veins carrying blood beneath ancient stone. Cassian slid his hand around Bathsheba's arm. After you, Bathsheba murmured, but her wand hand tightened slightly as she said it. He stepped into the shaft first. It sloped steeply downward, the damp mist clinging like cobwebs. Stone slick underfoot, Cassian moved cautiously, scanning the runes one last time for familiarity. There was none. The spiral had drawn them here, but what waited at its end? Check here. Hello everyone. Are you enjoying the FIC so far? I love to hear your thoughts, please leave comments and reviews. There will be double chapters tomorrow. I was planning to do it today, but the draft is deleted for some reason, maybe I forgot to save it and I am outside right now. Thank you all for your support.
Thanks for listening.